Hello, fellow sapiens. A quiet welcome to Midnight Sapien. Whether you're listening under the soft hum of nighttime rain, walking gently through your neighborhood, or lying still, unsure whether to rest or to think, this space is for you. Because tonight, we're asking a question older than fire. Why did humans start walking upright? This is deep time, told softly. Calm storytelling for curious apes. It's an untold chapter in the story of us. A tale shaped by 5 million years of shifting light, soft grass and bone. An ancient riddle that begins not with technology or thought, but with posture. But this is not the simple tale of progress or survival. It begins not with invention, but with imbalance. Not strength, but stumbling. Not with the brain, but with the spine. Oh, and if you're someone who enjoys long-form science told slowly, look just below the video. There's a button that says subscribe. You can tap it gently. You can unsubscribe at any time. And if you tap the little bell beside it, it'll quietly let you know when the next story arrives. That one click really matters. This channel depends on subscribers to survive. Without that support, these videos can't continue. By the way, where are you listening from tonight? What time is it right now in your corner of the world? If you feel like sharing, leave a quiet note in the comments. It's a small reminder that we're all listening together. Also, if you drift off, that's all right. Timestamps are in the description. And now, we begin with a flicker in the grass. Why did humans start walking upright? It seems like such a simple question, a fact so fundamental to our existence that we rarely pause to question its origin. We stand, we move, we carry, reach, wander. We do not hang from branches. We do not gallop or slither. We walk. And in that quiet, vertical gesture, bones stacked like tectonic plates under the pull of gravity, we are different. But this is not a tale of perfection or progress. It is the story of a narrow path, walked by chance and desperation, carved through the grasslands of deep time. And it begins, not with us, but with a flicker in the grass. 6 million years ago, the Earth breathed differently. The Miocene epoch, a time of great transition, was drawing to a close. Africa was no longer a continent of unbroken forest. The lush canopies that once blanketed vast regions were beginning to fragment, pulled apart by tectonic rumblings and atmospheric shifts. Rainfall patterns changed, temperatures dipped, forests thinned into woodlands, and woodlands unravelled into open savanna. What was once a ceiling of green became a patchwork of shadow and exposure. And in that new mosaic, something unthinkable happened. The rules of survival began to change. Among the animals forced to confront this new world were a group of primates, ape-like creatures with grasping feet and curling fingers who had lived for generations among branches, leaves, and silence. They were built to climb, to swing, to navigate verticality in a horizontal world. But the trees that cradled them were vanishing. What happens to a tree dweller when the trees begin to fall away? These early apes did not suddenly stand. They shifted, they paused, they adapted, one cautious experiment at a time. Their story is not one of transformation overnight, but of decisions made in dust and heat, under threat of thirst and claw. Among them, perhaps one of the first to venture regularly onto 2 feet, was a creature now known as Sahelanthropus chidensis, whose fossilized skull was found in the desert sands of Chad. Dated to nearly 7 million years ago, its foramen magnum, the hole at the base of the skull through which the spinal cord passes, was positioned farther forward than in other apes. A clue, a whisper, a possibility. Perhaps this one sometimes stood upright. Perhaps it tilted its head to scan a horizon rather than peer up into leaves. But was it choice or necessity? What does it mean to stand when everything around you is still crawling, climbing, bounding? What unseen forces shape a spine until it curves forward, until it balances upright like a reed swaying in wind? Was it the need to see predators across the tall grass? Was it hunger that drove them down, searching for fallen fruit or scavenged bone? Or was it the unpredictability of climate, the strange recurring pattern of forests expanding and retreating over millennia, that demanded flexibility over specialization? The savannah was not a gentle teacher. It was a realm of sudden change and endless exposure. To leave the safety of the canopy was to risk everything. Yet, within that risk, a possibility, a new relationship with the world. And once a creature begins to walk, what else begins to shift? A simple adjustment of posture is never just physical. It alters perspective. It reshapes the relationship between body and space, between self and danger, between movement and memory. To stand is to see further. To walk is to commit to a direction, to an exposure, to a future. And on the shifting edge between forest and savanna, our ancestors were being asked to commit without ever fully knowing the cost. It is difficult to picture a world so unlike our own. The African landscape of 6 million years past was a realm in flux, shaped by forces that moved too slowly for the eye to notice, and yet too quickly for life to remain unchanged. The Earth's tilt, its orbit, its seasonal rhythms, all conspired to tip the balance of rainfall, drawing once moist regions into long dry spells. Where thick jungle once reigned, grasses now dominated. Fire periodically swept the plains, water pooled in shrinking basins, and with each generation the trees pulled farther apart. The shift from a closed to an open environment did not simply pressure early apes to descend, it asked them to make impossible choices. Stay with the trees and compete in crowded canopies now shared by monkeys more agile and numerous. Or venture out, awkward, exposed, onto the earth, where predators could see them, but so too could new opportunities. This was the crucible of Sahelanthropus. We know little about its behaviour, less about its mind. But we can infer from its bones, thick brow ridges, small canine teeth, a mix of ape-like and human-like traits, that it lived in a transitional world. Its body tells of adaptation, but its surroundings whisper of constraint. To survive, it could not remain as it was. And so it walked. Not far, not often, not confidently, but it walked. A few steps at a time, a few seconds on 2 legs before falling again to 4. It was not alone in this experiment. In the shifting corridor of East and Central Africa, evolution began to scatter seeds of bipedality across different hominin lineages, each one a test, each one a question. How much uprightness was enough? How much was too much? Some branches of this evolutionary tree would embrace it fully. Others would retreat. Most would vanish entirely, leaving behind only fragments in sediment and stone. This is what makes the origin of bipedalism not a triumphant moment, but a riddle. There was no single point of emergence, no exact hour when a creature stood and never knelt again. It was a mosaic, a messy, beautiful confusion of limbs and habits, where walking upright was both a liability and a gift, a compromise, a possibility, a risk. And the question that lingered with every cautious step was the same. Is this the beginning of something new, or the end of something ancient? Because what we now call bipedalism was never the goal. Evolution has no foresight. It builds with what is at hand. It tinkers. It improvises. The upright posture of modern humans, our vertical gait, our aligned toes, our arched feet, was not crafted all at once. It was assembled slowly, unevenly, through a million tiny compromises. Each change brought new advantages but also new vulnerabilities. Standing tall made it easier to spot danger, yes, but it also made the spine bear a burden it had never known before. It freed the hands, but it endangered the back. It lifted the head, but it exposed the chest. What must it have felt like to be halfway between worlds? To not yet belong to the trees and not yet belong to the plains, to scramble up a trunk with hands that no longer gripped as easily, and to walk through grass with feet not yet made for distance. These early hominins were caught in the in-between. Their posture told of transformation, but their bodies still bore the past. Their hands curved like a climber's, their arms long and strong, their lives a negotiation between 2 realms. Fossil evidence from this period is rare. Bone decays. Time buries and crushes. But when fragments are found, like those of Orrorin tuganensis, dated to around 6 million years ago, they offer fleeting glimpses into this liminal state. Discovered in Kenya's Tugan Hills, Orrorin may have walked upright too. Its femur suggests it bore weight differently than modern apes. Not definitively, not entirely. but enough to raise the question, how many species were walking, wobbling, wavering, toward what we would one day become? These creatures did not know they were on the path to humanity. They did not walk with destiny in their stride. They walked because the canopy was too far and the water too distant. They walked because a broken forest forced them to cross open space. They walked because hunger pushed them, or because a new scent stirred curiosity, or because something dangerous rustled behind them. And in walking, they changed. But why did walking win? In evolutionary terms, many strategies can succeed. Some creatures fly, some dig, some swim. Others remain unchanged for eons, perfectly suited to their niche. Yet in the story of hominins, it was upright walking that endured, even as nearly all of the early walkers did not. The forest-dwelling apes who remained where they were, some vanished, others survived. The ones who stepped into the savannah had no guarantees, but their footsteps stretched farther. Bipedalism is often presented as a step forward, a mark of progress. But was it progress, or was it just persistence? A refusal to turn back, a willingness to risk imbalance in exchange for vision, a gamble made not once but countless times across millennia. What kind of creature takes such a risk? One that is not the strongest, not the fastest, not the most fearsome, but perhaps the most adaptable. The early hominins were not apex predators. They were small, vulnerable, and slow. Yet through their willingness to change, to test new ways of moving, to stretch the limits of balance and coordination, they carved out a future from uncertainty. In a world ruled by specialization, they chose flexibility. They were, in a sense, built to improvise. To walk upright is to place one's center of gravity on a tightrope, balanced precariously over two small supports. It demands an exquisite recalibration of muscles, joints, and instincts. And for creatures descended from branch-grasping apes, it was not only a mechanical transformation, it was perceptual. The view shifted. The angle of encounter changed. Where once they looked up through leaves, now they looked out, across savannah, toward distance, toward danger, toward possibility. Consider the predator. A lion crouches low in tall grass. A cheetah moves in bursts. A hyena circles under cover of dusk. To these animals, an upright figure is strange. It does not belong. It is seen sooner. It is heard differently. It watches without hiding. What must the first standing hominin have looked like to the beasts of the plain? A threat, a curiosity, a mistake. And yet, uprightness began to offer subtle advantages, not just in seeing danger, but in enduring it. Standing allowed for better heat dissipation under the harsh sun, less surface area exposed, more cooling from the breeze. Arms once used for climbing could now carry, cradle, throw. The hands were liberated, and with them, an entirely new chapter would one day begin. But not yet. At this early stage, walking was still an uncertain experiment. Not all hominins adopted it equally. Some remained in the trees, others alternated between quadrupedalism and bipedalism, adjusting to their terrain, to their needs. This period, spanning hundreds of thousands of years, was not a march forward, but a dance of survival. Some steps succeeded. Most ended in silence. Still, patterns began to emerge. In regions where the forest gave way to savanna, traces of uprightness appear more frequently. Fossils bearing subtle adaptations, a tilted pelvis here, a shortened toe there, suggest the slow accrual of change. Evolution was not racing forward. It was feeling its way through shadow and heat, through drought and flood, through extinction and emergence. So many questions remain unanswered. What was the precise trigger that led one lineage to walk where others crawled? Was it a mutation, a behavior passed on, a necessity that hardened into habit? We may never know, but within these questions lies something more important than answers. They remind us that our bodies are not the result of perfection, but of persistence, of trying, again and again, to survive in a world that refused to stay the same. Is it possible, then, that standing tall was not about strength at all, but about trust? Not trust in the sense of conscious choice, but in something quieter, deeper, a trust woven into bone and breath, a biological faith in the possibility of forward motion. To walk upright is to expose the heart, It is to lift the chest toward the sun, to place one foot in front of the other, knowing that balance can fail at any moment. Every stride is a fall that is caught just in time, and still. They walked. We speak of bipedalism as an adaptation, but in truth it was also a kind of surrender, a letting go of the past. A release of the safety once offered by thick branches and the shade of leaves. With each passing generation, the bodies of our ancestors tilted toward the ground, not in defeat but in commitment. Vertebrae reshaped, hip joints rotated. The foot, once curved for gripping, began to flatten and harden, becoming a platform not for perching, but for bearing weight. Change did not come all at once. It never does. But the direction was clear, and in that quiet revolution something else began to stir. The upright posture altered more than movement. It began to transform the mind. Walking freed the hands, yes, but it also created rhythm, a pace of thought, and breathing, and observation. It opened the possibility of persistence, of endurance over speed. It invited coordination, memory, and perhaps, eventually, imagination. Because to walk is not merely to move, it is to leave something behind. It is to choose a path and to follow it, even when the destination is unknown. Could it be that bipedalism was the first story we ever told? A story written not in words, but in footprints pressed into soft earth. Evidence that we passed this way, that we sought something, that we did not remain still. And as we reflect on those early walkers, Sahelanthropus, Orrorin, and others whose names are lost to time, we begin to see that their experiment was not a solitary one. It was the beginning of a lineage of beings who stood when it was easier to crawl, who crossed open ground when it was safer to stay hidden, who looked to the horizon and saw in it something worth moving toward. We are their legacy. The flicker in the grass was not just the start of a new gate. It was the first movement toward a new kind of being, a being that would one day speak, shape, remember, wonder. But before all that, before tools, before fire, before meaning itself, there was simply this, a creature, stepping carefully between shadow and sun, finding its balance on two uncertain legs. And with that first trembling posture, the long human journey began. Not with fire, not with language, not with a name carved in stone. It began with a shift in view, a horizon glimpsed from a height not offered by branches but by bone, upright, exposed, vulnerable, elevated. It was not just the act of walking that changed our ancestors. It was the world revealed by the act itself. What happens when the ground is no longer merely beneath you, but beneath your gaze? As early hominins stepped farther into open landscapes, they were entering a visual field unlike any they had known before. The forest had limits. It gave protection, but also enclosed the view. The savanna, in contrast, was expansive and unforgiving. There were no high limbs to flee to, no dense leaves to disappear behind. Everything was seen, and everything could see you. To walk here was to become part of the spectacle of life and death. But it was also to gain something new, perspective. Standing tall allowed a creature to scan above the grasses, to trace the movement of a lion through the shimmer of heat, to glimpse the ripple of a herd before it scattered. Height became awareness. The body became a lookout tower. In a world ruled by ambush, those extra seconds of foresight could be the difference between vanishing and surviving. This visual advantage did not make the early walkers safe, but it made them possible. And so, we return to the bones. In the hills of Kenya, fossil fragments of Orrorin tuganensis were uncovered. Femurs, teeth, bits of jawbone. Dated to roughly 6 million years ago, these remains whisper of a creature that walked, at least in part, on two legs. The femur, in particular, holds a quiet defiance. Its shape suggests it was adapted to bear weight in an upright posture, though the arms remained strong and suited for climbing. A dual life, 1 foot in the canopy, 1 foot on the earth. Further along the timeline, another name emerges, Ardipithecus ramidus. Found in Ethiopia and dated to over 4 million years ago, Ardi was a mosaic of possibility. Her pelvis told of bipedal walking, her feet of climbing. Her hands were not built for knuckle walking like a chimp's, but for something else, something halfway between reaching and holding. She too lived in the borderlands between the past and the future. What must it have felt like to be Ardi? To rise from sleep and cling to bark, yet know the rhythm of walking. To scan the ground for roots, but also scan the horizon for movement. To hear the world in both branches and breezes. Her life was not just a mixture of locomotion. It was a mixture of awareness, a wider frame, a different kind of seeing, and yet to stand in the open is also to be seen. To rise above the grasses is to lift your silhouette into the mind of the predator. The same posture that offers foresight also paints a target. Uprightness grants vision, but it also demands vulnerability. It is a posture of defiance, yes, but also of exposure. The early hominins who ventured into the open did not do so as conquerors. They did so as risks. Their bodies were neither built for speed nor shielded by armour. They had no claws to flash, no venom to deter. What they had was balance and a view. This duality of vision and vulnerability was etched into every stride. The moment the foot left the ground, the entire body had to adjust to remain standing. There was no guarantee of stability. Every step was a calculation, every journey a negotiation, and yet they kept moving. Across arid flats and thorny brush, across ancient floodplains and shallow riverbeds, the walkers moved. And the world watched them move. Perhaps this is what made them different. Not the shape of their bones, but the way they used space. They did not travel in bursts, they persisted, they endured. A slow, rhythmic passage through dangerous terrain, and in that rhythm the nervous system evolved a new kind of attention, an attunement to the environment, to motion, to meaning. A standing body had to be alert, not just to what was near, but to what was coming. The savannah was not kind. It was a place where silence often preceded violence, where the wind might carry both scent and sound of an approaching leopard, where a shadow at noon could mean death by dusk. To live in such a space was to cultivate awareness not just as a reaction, but as a practice. And so the upright posture was not only physical, it was cognitive. It demanded foresight. It invited planning. It encouraged memory. Where is the water? Where did the herd go? Where was the lion last seen? To answer these questions required more than instinct. It required the beginnings of mental maps of narrative, of story. The body that stood was now becoming a body that imagined. Could it be that our ancestors' first story was not told in words, but in movement? A tale carried in the arc of a journey, a warning left in the path taken, a knowledge passed through footsteps rather than sentences. When Ardipithecus scanned the horizon, she saw more than just threats. She saw opportunities, fruit trees in bloom, carrion left behind by toothier hunters, a shallow river glinting in the sun. Every detail mattered. Every flicker on the edge of vision held significance. To stand was to interpret, and to interpret was to survive. This act of uprightness, this ancient wager on vision over speed, on observation over strength, was not a final form, but a living process. It shaped not only the musculature and bone, but the very way the early hominin mind began to divide the world, between open and closed, seen and hidden, safe and unknown. To rise above the grass line was to emerge into a geometry of space where distance mattered, and so did timing. And timing, after all, is a form of thought. Imagine the predator's gaze. Imagine being watched. Not hunted in this moment, not yet, but evaluated. A figure upright in the shimmering heat, alone or among a few, quiet, moving with that strange steady gait. Not fleeing, not pouncing. Something else. Something uncertain. What is the predator to make of this? Standing upright introduced ambiguity into the visual theatre of the plains. In the animal kingdom, ambiguity can be protection. Many predators hesitate in the face of the unfamiliar. The upright posture may have disrupted the expectations of ancient carnivores, delayed their decision by a breath, and in that breath the walker might see, turn, and live. But it was not just the eyes of predators that mattered. It was the eyes of each other. The more time spent upright, the more early hominins began to notice one another's posture, a gesture, a lean, a stance. What was once a climbing limb was now a signalling device. The spine no longer just supported the body, it expressed intention, and with that shift, uprightness became social. Movement was no longer only about escape or approach, it became about attention. Who is alert? Who is calm? Who is afraid? These subtleties, once invisible in the trees, were suddenly readable across the plain. Distance did not always sever communication. It created a new kind of language, one built from the body. Perhaps it was here, in this silent vocabulary of posture and presence, that something like empathy began to flicker into being. Because to walk upright is to be alone, in a way that is visible. There is no hiding the self when exposed to the open sky. There is only the stance, the angle of the head, the direction of the gaze. These became signals, and in learning to read them, the early hominins were also learning to relate, to coordinate, to become more than one. Was bipedalism then the first form of communication? Not language in the sense of syntax, but meaning shaped in motion. A tilt to the left meaning caution, a sudden stillness meaning threat, a shared orientation toward the same distant object, a tree, a carcass, a shadow, meaning we see this together. To see together is to belong. This belonging was not yet culture. It was not art or fire or myth, but it was a tether, a thread of awareness drawn between individuals through gaze, direction and pace. In walking upright, our ancestors began to align not just their bodies, but their attention. Their survival increasingly depended on shared vigilance, on reading not only the land but each other. In this mutual exposure, something profound began to emerge, the roots of interdependence. When you move through open space on 2 feet, you move slowly. You cannot dart away like a gazelle, nor vanish upward into a tree like a monkey. You are committed to the path beneath you. This slowness, forced by anatomy, created need for planning. And planning required thought. It required learning from the past, anticipating the future, and acting in the fragile now. And the ground beneath them was a teacher like no other. The savannah did not forgive mistakes. A missed sign, a fresh track, a disturbed bush, a silent wind could mean the difference between return and disappearance. To walk through this world was to develop a kind of quiet reverence. Not fear exactly, but humility. A respect for all the eyes watching from the brush, for the rustle that might be nothing or everything. And as hominins became better walkers, they also became better listeners. Their senses honed to the direction of the breeze, to the pitch of a bird's warning, to the scent carried across a dry gully. This was the curriculum of survival. Attention sharpened by movement. Each footstep was both commitment and question. Is it safe? Is it time? Is this the way? The answer was never guaranteed. Still, they walked. In the fossil record, this story is preserved not in complete skeletons, but in fragments. A partial pelvis here, a toe bone there. Ardipithecus ramidus and Orrorin tuganensis are not ancestors with names and faces, but scattered clues in ancient dirt. And yet their bones hum with potential. A forward-tilted pelvis, a femur shaped by the load of upright weight, feet that still gripped but walked. They are not fully human and not fully ape. They are the transition made visible, and with each fossil unearthed, we uncover another moment in that long walk, a moment of change, of instability, of risk taken and balance found. The fossils are not just evidence of life, they are evidence of movement, the body remembered in stone. What story does a tilted hip tell? What lesson lies in the wear of a joint? These are not idle questions. They are keys. Each bone is a door into a world of almosts, of creatures on the edge of becoming, of beings who stood not because they wanted to, but because the world required it. What else does the world require for vision to become survival? It requires memory, and not just the memory of an individual, but the memory held in groups, of paths once walked, of dangers once escaped, of water found during a heat not felt in generations. Standing upright placed hominins in a world that was not just seen, but remembered. The horizon was no longer just distance. It became a promise, a warning, a map of where not to go or where to return when the dry season passed. To see the world from a height is to carry its shape in your mind, and with each return, each passage through a familiar clearing, or along a familiar ridge, early humans stitched together a mental tapestry of land, time, and survival. This mental map was not drawn in pigments or carved in stone. It was etched into the nervous system, into the body's rhythm. Upright walking is an act of continuity. It favours long distances, endurance over sprinting, stamina over stealth. To travel far is to accumulate impressions, to compare what was with what is. A tree that once bore fruit now bare, a river once shallow now swollen. This comparison is the seed of pattern recognition, and from pattern recognition grows something even more elusive: anticipation. Could it be that bipedalism was the beginning of human time? Not just the measurement of seasons, but the awareness of before and after, the recognition that paths have direction, that actions have consequence, that danger has memory, that opportunity has timing. These realizations, fragile and primitive at first, were encoded not in language but in motion, in how and when and why they walked, and the land responded in kind. Every step pressed into earth became part of a larger conversation. The soil, the stones, the changing grasses, each recorded a fragment of the journey. Fossilized footprints, when preserved, offer some of the most intimate glimpses into early life. Not bones, but choices, spacing between steps, direction, pace, sometimes even the hint of a child walking beside an adult. These are echoes of decision, of intention, of relationship, and they remind us that the ground beneath us is never just ground. It is the archive of all who have passed. In this quiet history we glimpse the deeper truth of standing upright. It was never about domination. It was not a conquest of terrain. It was a conversation with it, a way of seeing, being seen, and remembering. The posture that exposed them also expanded them, and in that expansion, a new kind of life emerged, one not faster, not stronger, but more aware. To rise above the grass is to take in the world as whole. To commit to walking is to believe the future is worth reaching, and so they stood, and so they saw, and so, with every cautious stride into the open, the earth welcomed a new kind of gaze, one that would shape not only what was visible, but what could be imagined. But vision alone was never enough. In deep time, the horizon was not a promise. It was a threat. A storm gathering out of frame, a change that did not announce itself with thunder, but with silence, the kind that settles over drying rivers and cracked mud, over leafless trees that once whispered in the wind. The world our ancestors inherited was not a stable one. It pulsed and lurched, split and stitched, flooded and burned. This was not a setting. It was a crucible, and the fire was not just metaphor. It rained from the sky. In the eastern bones of Africa, the earth tore itself apart. This was the birth of the Great Rift Valley, a gash that runs like a scar down the length of the continent, where tectonic plates pulled away from one another and left behind a fractured corridor of volcanoes, escarpments, shifting basins and lakes that came and went like breath. This was not a passive landscape. It moved, it cracked, it bled magma and ash, and in its violent rhythms it remade everything living within its grasp. To live here was to live in a world always in transition. Forests grew dense, then fell away. Lakes swelled to the horizon, then vanished into dust. Rivers changed their course like serpents slipping between stones. For the early hominins who stood upon this ground, the rules never stayed the same, and so the bodies that survived were not those made for a single world, but for many. This is the paradox at the centre of our evolution. We did not emerge because the world calmed down. We emerged because it didn't. The species that endured were not the most specialised, but the most responsive. Generalists, risk-takers, thinkers, beings that could adapt to forests in one generation, grasslands in the next, beings whose anatomy was open to suggestion, whose minds were sculpted by necessity. Fire did not forge our tools first. It forged our adaptability, and the clues lie everywhere, in ash layers miles thick, in sediment twisted by tectonic force, in lake beds dry for thousands of years then full again. The earth wrote our story in violence, not because it hated us, but because it gave us no choice. And so, upright walking became something more than a way to see or move. It became a wager against the chaos of climate. How do you walk forward when the path keeps vanishing? You don't memorize the road, you memorize how to walk, because when the trees disappear you cannot mourn them for long. You must scan the horizon for water. When the wind changes you cannot wait for its return. You must turn your body into an instrument tuned to variability itself. This was not a single event, but a recurring crucible. Each generation born into a world slightly unlike the one before. Slightly drier, slightly colder, slightly more uncertain. And here, in the pulse of climate shifts, evolution whispered new instructions. The fossils from this time speak not of smooth transition, but of splintered adaptation. Species came and went like echoes. Some tried to hold on to the canopy, clinging to the old ways, their limbs still suited for climbing. Others gambled on the open. They stood, walked, watched. Some vanished, others endured. It was not that walking upright guaranteed survival. It didn't. But it did open the door to something else: flexibility. Upright walking freed the hands. It stretched the range. It lowered the cost of movement across long distances. It meant less skin exposed to the sun, less energy lost to the heat. It meant endurance. And endurance in a world that kept falling apart was a kind of wisdom. Because what does the earth demand of those who walk upon it? Not permanence, but participation. To live in the Rift Valley was to live in a place where land could be paradise one year and wasteland the next. The lush would vanish, the rain would shift, the fertile basin would become a barren salt flat. And yet, life persisted. It found new ways to move, new routes to eat, new places to hide. But not all creatures could pivot fast enough. This is where climate becomes a sculptor, not of the landscape, but of the mind. The rapid cycles of environmental change, some stretching over only a few thousand years, created what researchers call variability selection. It is not a single pressure, but a mosaic of them, changing and recombining, demanding that species not adapt to a condition, but to change itself. It is here, many scientists believe, that the evolutionary pressure for larger brains began to intensify. Because to survive in the Great Rift Valley was not just to change, it was to predict, to remember that the lake once dried, to wonder if it might again, to notice when the trees fruit earlier, to sense when the herds move farther than usual. This is not instinct, this is observation, this is foresight, this is the slow emergence of a mind that doesn't just react to the world, it reflects on it. What kind of creature reflects while walking, and what happens when that reflection becomes legacy? It begins to echo beyond the individual. It shapes how children are taught, not just what to fear, but what to watch. It weaves memory into movement. It binds observation to meaning, and over generations those meanings accumulate, not as language at first, not as myth, but as pattern, as rhythm, as expectation. This is how intelligence is seeded in chaos, not by resisting it, but by learning to move within it. In this unstable world, walking upright became not just a tool of travel, but of time. The endurance gait of early hominins, slow, balanced, efficient, allowed them to traverse expanding territories as forests thinned and food grew scarce. They followed the rains, they shadowed migrating herds. They returned to drying lakes in hope of a few lingering shellfish or trapped fish. They walked not in straight lines, but in loops, in cycles, in memory-mapped paths that became invisible routes of survival. Their footprints were not random, they were records. And every record told the same story. The world does not wait. Even fire, so often imagined as the great leap forward, may have first entered their lives not through mastery, but as consequence. The Rift Valley was not just tectonic, it was volcanic. Eruptions swept the sky with ash, coated the plains in fine dust that settled into sediment, preserved footprints and bones. Lightning sparked fires in the dry grass, stripping the land bare, revealing insects and roots, killing trees but fertilizing soil. Fire came before it was controlled. It changed the world before it was understood. And under that fire-filled sky, the upright walkers endured. They moved differently. They planned differently. They noticed things others didn't. Their range grew. Their bodies changed. Hips widened. toes aligned, the spinal curve deepened to balance the head. But evolution does not trade imperfections, it trades intolerable compromises. Upright walking placed new stresses on joints, the lower back, the knees, and yet the benefits outweighed the pain, because what it offered could not be measured in steps. It could only be measured in futures, and so instability became inheritance. The creatures who survived were not those who found a stable niche, but those who carried adaptability in their bones. Their anatomy told the story of an earth that never stood still. And their posture, the strange gamble of standing tall in a world so often falling apart, became a monument to that gamble. What does it mean that we are shaped not by what is, but by what changes? That our balance, our stride, our thoughts, all trace back to a landscape that cracked and shook and split beneath our feet? Are we not, then, the children of rupture? And if so, what did we learn by walking its edge? We learned that the world would not shape itself to our needs, that we would need to shape ourselves to its mood, that no mountain would stay the same height, that no river would promise its return, that no wind would keep its course. In the flicker of firelight and under skies darkened by ash, our ancestors learned to become students of uncertainty, and not merely to survive it, but to grow within it. This is the hidden genius of bipedalism. It was never a symbol of triumph. It was a strategy for endurance. It did not make our ancestors kings of the savannah. It made them pilgrims of it, travellers on a land always turning beneath their feet. To walk upright is to rise into a changing world, not to conquer it, but to meet it at eye level. And that height changed everything. When you stand, you see storms coming before others do. You see the herd scattering long before the dust reaches your skin. You see the birds spiralling in the sky and begin to wonder what's beneath them. Uprightness turned hominins into witnesses, and witnessing over time became cognition, but that gift came with a cost. To walk upright was to carry the body in a precarious equilibrium. The pelvis narrowed, making childbirth more dangerous. The spine compressed, bringing with it pain and vulnerability. A fall could be fatal. Speed was lost, safety was compromised. Yet again and again, nature returned to the same solution, not because it was perfect, but because it was open-ended. Uprightness, like the climate itself, was a field of possibility. The fossil record confirms this tension. In the same layers where we find evidence of advanced upright posture, we also find diversity, different species experimenting with different proportions, different degrees of bipedal commitment. Some had long arms and curved fingers, a life still tethered to the trees. Others bore shorter limbs and a stronger pelvic bowl, adapted more fully to the ground. These were not mistakes or failed versions. They were attempts, each one a unique response to instability. And as the world kept shifting, one lineage began to walk farther than the rest. The feet became flatter, the toes realigned. The arch began to spring the body forward with each step. The hands, increasingly freed, started carrying more than food. They began to carry memory, intention, objects shaped with purpose. And the eyes, those ever-watchful sentinels, grew more sensitive not only to movement, but to change, to the difference between now and before. Could it be that walking upright gave us not just freedom of the hands, but freedom of time, that by standing we began not only to see distance, but to imagine what might lie beyond it? What kind of mind begins with footsteps and ends with foresight? A mind forged in the chaos of shifting earth and vanishing trees, a mind that does not merely react but reconfigures, one that remembers where the water once was, where the shade fell last season, where the wind carried ash from a mountain that is no longer there. Upright walking was not just a mode of movement, it was an invitation into time, into history, into memory, into the awareness that things change, and in that change, we must find our way. We often imagine evolution as sculpting toward perfection, but here, perfection would have meant extinction. The Rift Valley did not reward the best. It rewarded the most willing, the most attuned, the ones who stood up not to rule the land but to read it, to anticipate its tremors, to adapt their hunger to its offerings, to shift their migrations with its seasons. This is where the walker becomes the thinker. Not in silence, but in struggle. Not in stillness, but in motion. The act of walking under skies streaked with fire and ash was not just about finding food. It was about stitching together a map of cause and effect, about noticing that rains came later than before, that fruiting trees no longer bore, that something in the air or the soil or the light had changed, and with it so must the path. And perhaps, in that moment of change, a new kind of awareness flickered to life. Because to change the path is to declare that you remember the old one, to alter direction is to weigh futures, and to walk in a new direction is to cast a vote, not just for survival, but for possibility. Upright walking gave our ancestors the capacity to project themselves forward, to wonder if there might be something beyond the next ridge, beyond the dried-up lake, beyond the burnt savanna. They did not know what they would find, but they walked, through ash fields and floodplains, past elephant bones picked clean and forests turned to ember. They walked as the earth trembled, cracked, healed, and cracked again. And in doing so, their bodies changed, their minds changed, until one day, perhaps without noticing, they were no longer just reacting to the world, they were anticipating it. This was not the end of evolution, it was its turning point. Because when the earth sculpted fire into the sky and tore open the crust beneath our ancestors' feet, it also opened something else, a window, a threshold, a new way of being. Upright walking did not make us dominant. It made us responsive. It made us watchful. It made us wonder. And through that wonder, something else began to take shape. Not just a body that could walk, but a mind that could remember why it did. To walk was to survive, but to keep walking, to move not in bursts but in long, patient lines across the savannah, was something else entirely. It was not just endurance of the body, it was endurance of attention, of decision, of memory. Upright walking had begun as a biological accident and became a functional tool, but now it was taking on a new shape, rhythm, and rhythm would change everything. What does it mean to become a creature of distance? As the earth cooled and the forest thinned, new pressures emerged, not as violent shifts but as absences. Shade vanished, food dispersed, water wandered. Each of these pressures asked a question of the hominin body, and each time the answer bent toward the same truth. Go farther, carry less, burn slower, persist longer. Standing upright, though energetically costly at first glance, became a thermal advantage. When the equatorial sun beat down across the open plain, quadrupeds exposed broad swaths of their backs to the heat. But a bipedal frame, narrow and vertical, minimized solar exposure and maximized convective cooling. Air passed freely around the torso, evaporating sweat more efficiently. The head, now lifted above the ground, caught breezes otherwise lost in the heat shimmer of the grass. Could it be that walking saved us not from predators, but from the sun itself? With upright posture, the body also became a walking radiator. Sweat glands multiplied, hair thinned, and the cardiovascular system adapted to keep the brain cool in extreme heat, protecting the organ that evolution was increasingly investing in. The upright body became a chassis not for strength, but for stamina. And this stamina offered an unexpected gift, the ability to move not fast, but far, very far. This shift laid the foundation for what may be one of the most extraordinary hunting strategies ever observed in the animal kingdom. Persistence hunting, not by speed, not by stealth, but by not stopping. Imagine a group of early hominins long before tools became precise, before weapons became efficient, tracking a wounded antelope through the midday heat. Each time the animal bolts, it must stop to cool, it pants, it overheats, its muscles cramp. But the humans, they walk, they trot, they follow the trail not with fangs but with foresight. They read the signs in the dust, the broken stalk, the turn of a hoofprint, the smell of fear. And eventually, after hours, sometimes even days, the animal collapses. What kind of intelligence is born in that chase? One that maps the land in slow turns and long memories. One that values patience over power. One that places trust not in momentary violence, but in steady rhythm. Upright walking became more than anatomy. It became a strategy of time. a declaration of confidence that the world could be outlasted, not just overcome. And so the stride lengthened, not in speed, but in vision, in intention, in resilience. It is here, in this patient motion across ancient ground, that we find the first signs of a mind not only responding to the world, but preparing for it. The laterly footprints, pressed into volcanic ash some 3.6 million years ago, in what is now Tanzania, stand as quiet testimony to this awakening. 2, perhaps 3 individuals walking upright in parallel, not dashing, not hunting, simply moving, side by side, step by step. One appears to pause briefly, turning their foot slightly inward, as if adjusting pace or glancing behind. A gesture caught not in bone, but in ash and time. They were Australopithecus afarensis, small-bodied, long-armed, but unmistakably bipedal. And in that stride a story begins to crystallize. The story of hominins not just walking toward food or away from danger, but toward each other, together. To move across vast landscapes requires more than legs. It requires trust. Who will find water first? Who will remember the landmarks, the twisted tree, the stone outcrop, the hidden spring? Who will lead? Who will follow? The body alone cannot answer these questions. Cooperation must rise to meet the distance, and in doing so, movement begins to shape not only muscle, but mind. Because every journey of endurance is also a rehearsal of prediction. You must know when to rest and when to press on. You must plan what to carry and what to leave behind. You must sense when an animal is near, when a storm is building, when a path has vanished. These decisions do not emerge in the moment. They are sculpted across time, and time, for the bipedal walker, stretches wider with every step. It is tempting to think of early hominins as primitive, scratching out a living on the margins of a harsh world. But this view flattens the brilliance of their adaptations. Persistence hunting is not born of desperation. It is born of endurance thinking, of seeing movement not as fleeing, but as becoming. And in every long pursuit, in every day spent walking from one horizon to the next, a new kind of consciousness flickered into being. One that does not just react, but anticipates. This anticipation is the beginning of foresight, and foresight is a kind of memory turned forward. It requires mental time travel. What will the herd do when the rains come? Where did the berries ripen last year? What dangers lie between here and the next shadow? To be bipedal was not simply to stand, it was to see, to hold in one's mind the invisible map of past and future, and to walk it. And so, the stride of survival became the stride of awareness, a mind moving as steadily as the body. In this growing synchrony between thought and movement, something profound began to emerge. Walking became not merely a response to hunger or fear, but a practice of presence. Each step brought with it a calibration of attention. Where is the sun? How dries the grass? What shape does the wind carve in the dust? In a world without clocks, gait was tempo. In a world without roads, rhythm was compass. And in that rhythm, culture began to take its first steps. Because to move together is to begin to share the invisible. No longer just food or fire, but ideas, strategies, sequences of action. If the group succeeded in chasing down a kudu after a day's pursuit, that victory was not just physical, it was intellectual. It meant someone noticed where it fled. Someone chose to track instead of rest. Someone predicted the animal's exhaustion before it occurred. These are not brute instincts, these are hypotheses in motion, and so, planning, the hallmark of human cognition, may have been born not in stillness, but in stride. The long walk gave time for thought to stretch its legs. Decisions weren't always urgent. Some were slow, unfolding over the hours between waterholes or the quiet dusk when the body cooled. In those moments, shared movement became shared mind. Patterns were noticed, passed on. The terrain became a kind of memory theatre. This is where the rains fell. This is where the roots hide. This is where the leopard was last seen. And as memories accumulated, so too did relationships, because movement required negotiation. Who keeps pace with the child? Who walks ahead to scout? Who circles back to check for stragglers? The answers to these questions weren't encoded in biology alone. They had to be learned, taught, decided, together. And in that togetherness, bipedalism became not just a physical adaptation, but a social one. There's a quiet poetry in imagining our ancestors walking through the golden light of early evening, calloused feet pressing into warm soil, shadows growing long, the air beginning to cool. Their tools were simple, their shelters temporary. But their minds, honed by miles of observation, were rich with strategy, awareness, and care. This is what the stride gave them, not just a way to cover ground, but a way to see the world more clearly, to feel it beneath their feet, to read its signs not as static facts but as shifting possibilities. And in those possibilities, they found a kind of freedom. Not the freedom of safety, but of choice. The freedom to move, the freedom to think ahead. What does it mean to be a creature whose thoughts are shaped by motion? It means that even now when we walk, something ancient awakens. We may not chase game across the savannah or follow a riverbed for days without knowing where it ends. But in the rhythm of walking, in the quiet cadence of heel to toe, breath to thought, we tap into a lineage that spans millions of years, a lineage that taught us to link the outer journey with the inner one. To walk forward was to think forward, to move was to imagine. This, perhaps more than anything, Brie, is the legacy of the stride, because movement, at its deepest level, is not just about locomotion, it's about orientation, not just to space but to time. Our ancestors began to understand that the future was not a vague mist ahead, but something that could be prepared for step by step. The very act of placing one foot in front of the other became a rehearsal for everything that would come to define human life. Sequencing, patience, pattern recognition, and ultimately storytelling. To walk a path was to create a narrative. You began in one place, moved through another, and ended somewhere new. And with each return to that path, season after season, generation after generation, a structure took form in the mind, the notion that events have order, that decisions shape outcomes, that movement is meaning. The earth became a scroll, and the stride a stylus. This story is etched most clearly not in tools or bones, but in footprints. The Laetoli trackway, so softly pressed into volcanic ash, remains one of our most intimate relics of prehistoric life. No bones, no weapons, just feet, just walking. It tells us nothing of language, and yet everything of presence. The gait suggests a deliberate pace, perhaps a family, perhaps companionship, a trace left not in stone, but in movement, as if to say, we were here, we walked, we chose a direction, and with that choice, the world opened. Because bipedalism wasn't only about the mechanics of movement, it was about the emergence of intention. The stride freed the hands, yes, but it also freed the mind from reacting only to the immediate. It made the unknown reachable. And once the unknown could be reached, it could be wondered about. What lies beyond that hill? What comes after the rains? What happens if we wait? These are not questions of survival alone. They are questions of imagination. And imagination, once sparked, never quite goes out. It flickers, it stretches, it lingers in the long shadows of the walking body, gliding across plains where no footprints remain. And so, walking became a way of thinking, and thinking became a way of surviving. We are the descendants of those who did not stop, who moved even when the way was uncertain, who turned locomotion into legacy. This legacy lives on, not just in our anatomy, but in our metaphors. We follow a path, take steps, go the distance. Our language remembers what our bodies once knew intimately, that meaning unfolds in motion, that understanding, like migration, is a journey. And in every journey there is a rhythm. That rhythm began with the stride of survival. Australopithecus afarensis did not know what would become of her footprints. She did not know that her careful placement of each foot would one day be studied as evidence of bipedal gait. She was not thinking of anthropology or adaptation. She was simply moving with purpose, with awareness, perhaps with others, perhaps with a child. But in that motion was a seed, a habit of forwardness, of staying with the journey, even when the destination was not clear. That is the heart of endurance, not just to keep going, but to keep believing that something lies ahead. Water, shelter, opportunity, connection. The long walk trains not only the muscles but the mind to stay with the unknown, and this training, repeated over millennia, began to shape more than survival. It shaped cognition. We learned to synchronize our inner world with the land beneath us, to track the passage of time not only by the stars or seasons, but by the feeling of weariness, the hunger that comes before dusk, the coolness of air when night falls. These were not measurements in numbers, but in motion. To walk upright was to be woven into the tempo of Earth itself. It's a quiet kind of wisdom, one that doesn't shout but hums. It says stay with it, follow the track, read the signs, listen to your breath, step with care, move with intention. This was not the brute force of domination, but the slow power of harmony. And in that harmony, the early walker became something more than a survivor. She became a knower of landscapes, a keeper of roots, a mind in motion. So often we ask, when did humans begin to think? But perhaps the better question is, when did we begin to think like walkers? When did we learn to link pacing with patience, to string together a memory with movement, to feel meaning stretch between one footprint and the next? Walking upright taught our ancestors many things, how to hunt, how to travel, how to endure. But perhaps its greatest gift was the mental horizon it opened, a way to hold the past and the future in the same stride. And so we end not with a triumphant arrival, but with a continuation. The road still stretches, the rhythm still calls. And somewhere in the gentle thud of your own footsteps on the ground, a memory stirs, a memory older than language, older than fire, older than names, the memory of forwardness, the memory of the stride. Fear, not fire, may have been the first force to gather us together. Long before the shaping of tools or the lighting of flame, long before words gave structure to thought, there was the raw instinct to survive. In the open grasslands of the early Pleistocene, fear was not a flaw in the system, it was the system, and it pulsed strongest when the wind shifted and the shadows moved, when the herd of antelope suddenly bolted for no visible reason, when birds took flight without sound. There were patterns in that chaos, signs etched in muscle and silence, and those who lived long enough to read them passed something on. Not just their genes, but their vigilance. What must it have felt like to stand upright in such a world? To be taller, yes, but also slower. To no longer vanish into the trees or scale the nearest branch. The early hominins, small-bodied, lightly built, less clawed, less fanged, were exposed. Their height gave them vision, but it also made them a target. On the plains of what is now Kenya and Tanzania, the great cats prowled low. Hyenas cackled through the dusk. The saber-toothed machaerodonts, now extinct, stalked with precision honed over millions of years. And the hominin line, standing precariously on 2 feet, was still new to this theatre. Predators have always written their own chapters in the story of evolution. They do not merely chase, they shape. The great cats selected for awareness, the crocodiles for caution near water, the hyenas for the discipline of sleep in numbers. Our ancestors were not the fastest runners nor the fiercest fighters, but they endured because they learned to see the world not just through their own eyes, but through the imagined perspective of another. Where might danger be hiding? What would it do next? And in this act of imaginative simulation, born of fear, refined by repetition, the earliest flickers of theory of mind began to stir. But theory is no use alone. To survive the predators of open land, a single alert hominin was not enough. Awareness had to become audible. The raised arm, the sudden stillness, the barked warning cry, these became early signals of something shared. And it is in that moment, when vigilance passed from one body into another, that something changed in us. The herd was no longer just a loose aggregation of individuals. It became a social field, a sensor net, a system of mutual gaze. How do you survive when you're not the strongest, the fastest, or the most well-armed? You survive by noticing, together. And slowly, over countless generations, this noticing became culture. The body stood upright, but the mind began to tilt sideways, toward the other, toward the group. And out of this sliver of cognitive attention, This fragile habit of checking, mimicking, alerting, a new kind of social being was taking shape. Not just a biped, but a sentinel. Not just a survivor, but a witness. A walker of grasslands haunted by the eyes that watched from the shadows. Those shadows were not imagined. They were real, lethal, silent, and endlessly adaptive. But within the darkness, something else stirred. Not just the threat of death, but the pressure of invention. The presence of predators didn't just sculpt reflexes. It shaped our ancestors' need to understand one another. Fear, as primal and piercing as it is, began to function as a bridge. When one member of the group noticed danger and responded, freezing, flinching, fleeing, others learned to read that signal. The body became a language, a raised brow, a stiffened spine, a sudden hush. Even silence became rich with meaning. And the meaning was always this: something is near. Bipedalism may have left our ancestors vulnerable in some ways, but it also created a new advantage: visibility, height, a field of view that swept wider than before. Upright posture extended the sensory perimeter of the group. One could spot movement across the grass from farther away, even just the flick of an ear or the ripple of fur in golden light. But this sightline was only powerful when others could be warned, and so social cooperation became more than a strategy. It became an extension of the body itself. To stand upright meant more than being seen. It meant seeing for others. When a child stumbled or cried, the group noticed. When an elder paused too long, someone glanced back. In this awareness of others' needs, fear began to be metabolized into something subtler, something that would one day resemble empathy. Not in the moral sense, not yet, but as a practical tether, a rhythm of attention that bound individuals together, not by affection, but by necessity. Predators had sharpened the senses, but it was cooperation that sharpened the mind. And this cooperation had costs. To help another is to risk delay. To respond to someone else's alarm is to believe them. To circle back for a straggler is to turn one's back to the threat. These are not trivial acts. They are small decisions made in real time under pressure, and yet, over and over, our ancestors chose togetherness, chose to live and move as a unit, chose to turn their vulnerability into a kind of strength, not by erasing it, but by distributing it. And the more they did this, the more attuned they became. The herd was no longer just a group of moving bodies. It became an organism of shared perception, and with that came memory, not individual memory, but social memory. Where was the leopard seen last? Which tree sheltered us best in the rain? Who knows the path across the riverbed? These were not solitary facts, but communal holdings. Survival was not only about muscle or speed, it was about remembering, together. And in this shared remembering, something new stirred beneath the fear. A faint awareness, not just of threat, but of presence, of the other as someone who feels. This wasn't yet empathy as we know it, not the full-bloomed compassion of the later human societies, but it was a seed, an intuitive echo, the flinch of one body mirrored in another, the gasp of alarm transferred unspoken from mind to mind. In the shadow of predators, hominins began to perceive each other not as moving parts of a defensive machine, but as carriers of inner states, of alarm, of relief, of curiosity. This was the first light of shared mind. The predator-prey dynamic had unknowingly written the first lines of intersubjectivity. This was a world where lions tested not just muscle, but cohesion, where survival depended less on raw strength than on the choreography of attention. Predators did not simply remove the weak, they selected against the uncooperative. In doing so, they sculpted not the individual, but the social fabric. And in that fabric, emotions, once purely internal, became external cues. A startled gaze, a trembling hand, a low cry, all became tools for transmitting experience. Fear, it turns out, is contagious, but so is care. And in these earliest transfers of feeling, the scaffolding of something enduring was taking form, a nervous system that extended beyond the skin, a network of reciprocal minds. The bipedal body, vulnerable and exposed, became a conductor for this current. It walked not just on two legs, but within a living web of shared risk and mutual recognition. And yet, even this web had its tension, because every predator encounter posed a choice: protect the group or protect the self. Many surely fled without looking back. Many must have perished alone. But enough turned toward one another, enough paused, enough warned, enough remembered that something shifted in the species. A bias toward the collective began to be inscribed in bone and behaviour. This was no utopia. Conflict and competition pulsed through early hominin life, just as they do now. But the open ground demanded a minimum of unity. A predator could not be reasoned with, nor outrun. It could only be outsmarted, together. And so, those who read others best, who noticed fear first, who coordinated their movements most fluidly, began to survive more often, and their descendants in turn carried those traits forward, not just in their bones, but in the slow accretion of behavioural nuance. Even the simplest acts, pausing for a companion, mimicking another's alarm, became evolutionarily significant. These were not grand gestures, they were micro-adjustments, subtle shifts in attention and reaction. But when repeated across generations, they became structural. They laid the groundwork for what would later become language, kinship, grief. The body stood upright, yes, but it also leaned, just slightly, toward the other, toward the herd. And in that lean, fear became not a wall, but a bridge between isolated nervous systems, a bridge between moments of flight and moments of trust. Through it, the mind of one became entangled with the mind of another, not through deliberate choice, but through necessity. The savannah did not offer the safety of solitude, it rewarded connection, and connection, in turn, shaped cognition. The open landscape was not just a setting, it was a sculptor. It carved away what could not cooperate, it refined what could anticipate. And so, slowly, standing upright became more than a posture, it became a vantage point, not only in the physical sense with its elevated field of view, but in a cognitive sense, the ability to see the world from where another stands. And this mattered deeply, because with that shift in perspective, survival strategies evolved beyond reaction. They became predictive. The hominin who could imagine what a predator might do next, or how another group member might respond, had an edge. This was not rational calculation, not yet. It was embodied intuition, a pre-linguistic murmur of if this then that. It was strategy born in the body, refined through walking, honed through watching. Predators taught us how to feel each other, not in sentimental terms but in terms of movement, breath, posture, gaze. And in those readings, trust began to emerge, not the deep trust of bonded pairs, but the provisional trust of a species learning to coordinate, to step in time, to pause when others paused, to know, without being told, that now is the time to run. It is tempting to think of fear as a weakness, but fear, shared wisely, is intelligence. It teaches boundaries, it sharpens perception, it makes possible the careful art of not dying. And for early bipeds, naked, slow, often hungry, this art was sacred. It asked for nothing less than full attention. The ears tilted toward the wind, the eyes scanning the grass line, the mind ready to leap from the present to the possible in a single heartbeat. The great predators were not just enemies, they were instructors. Each encounter pressed deeper into the evolving brain the need for others, the need to read others, to move with them, to remember with them. The best defense was not in fleeing fastest, it was in feeling first, in becoming sensitive not only to the land, but to the subtle tremors of group behaviour. This sensitivity, honed over hundreds of thousands of years, laid the groundwork for a species that would eventually tell stories, sing songs, bury its dead. But for now, that future was only a flicker, a trace in the dust, a shift in posture, a shadow seen and shared. And as dusk settled across the plains, and the air cooled and the grasses whispered, our ancestors gathered not because they understood each other, but because they understood something was out there, and that they were safer somehow together. That quiet knowledge, unspoken, instinctive, was one of our earliest collective truths. It shaped the way hominins slept, moved, and raise their young. The vulnerability of walking upright did not disappear. Our ancestors still bore the risks of exposure, of slowness, of the fragile body held upright against the wind. But they learned, generation after generation, to hold that vulnerability communally, and in that something profound began to shift. The upright body, once an experiment in locomotion, became the anchor of a shared horizon. One could stand beside another and see what they saw. One could point, gesture, call out, knowing that what lay ahead was no longer a private view, but a mutual space of concern. The savannah became not just a danger zone, but a dialogue. And within that dialogue, early empathy matured from reflex to ritual. To feel with others became a strategy, then a strength, then a story. It is here, in this long stretch of the early Pleistocene, that we glimpse the emotional infrastructure that would define our species, the capacity to co-suffer, to co-fear, and eventually to co-hope. Predators had taught us to read the land, but they also taught us to read each other. In every trembling limb or widened eye, our ancestors saw a reflection of their own experience, and in that reflection, recognition flickered. Recognition, not just of another body, but of another being, and once that flame was lit, it could not be unlit. The herd, once just a tactic, became a context, a place where identity was not merely individual but relational. You were not just a walker of the plains, you were someone who watched for others, someone who was watched for in return. The self became porous, attuned to the needs, movements, and feelings of the group. It is no accident that from this social matrix would one day emerge language, ethics, kinship. But those were still distant ripples. For now, it was the simple gestures that mattered. The alert glance, the warning call, the decision to walk beside the weary rather than ahead. These were the seeds, and even though the predators remained, silent, patient, deadly, the herd endured. Because it had become more than flesh and bone. It had become mind, a shared mind strung across many bodies. And in that mind, fear lived. Yes, but so did a care. So did memory. So did the beginnings of all the stories we would later tell to make sense of being alive in a world that was not built for our survival. We were never the strongest, we were never the fastest, but we watched, we warned, we walked together, and in the long arc of evolution, that was enough. Enough to survive, enough to become. To stand upright is to become an axis, a vertical thread through horizontal time. And from that axis, something astonishing unspooled. Not just movement, not just sight, but a pair of hands liberated at last from the task of holding on. What happens when a limb once meant for grasping branches is suddenly granted a different destiny? What happens when the hands, once curled in arboreal instinct, find themselves empty in the open air? The human hand is an evolutionary riddle, carved slowly by accident and necessity across eons of shifting stone and sinew. It is not a hand of strength, not like a gorilla's knuckle or a chimpanzee's power grip. It is a hand of finesse, a whisper of pressure, a dialogue between the thumb and the fingertips capable of nuance, of gentleness, of tools, of symbols. But that hand began as something else entirely. It began as a clawed compromise in the trees of the Miocene. As primates adapted to branch walking and vertical clinging, their digits elongated, their nails flattened. Precision began as a balance act. Each subtle curve and joint of the hand learned to answer the demands of gravity with control rather than force, and then came bipedalism. To walk upright is to remove the hands from their ancient duty. No longer required for locomotion, they were repurposed, not by intent but by consequence. The change was anatomical, yes, but it was also philosophical. What is a hand if not bound to the ground? What new role must it play? One answer, as always, came through bone. In East Africa, nearly 2.5 million years ago, fragments of a species called Homo habilis, handy man, began to surface beneath the dust. These early humans bore the marks of both transformation and transition. Their hands were not fully modern, but they carried the signatures of possibility, broad fingertips, enhanced nerve endings, and a thumb more capable of opposition than anything before. What must it have felt like to hold something for the first time, not as a reaction, but as a choice, not to swat, or to clutch, or to cling, but to shape, to strike, to plan? Because that is what the older one tool culture represents, not simply rocks chipped for sharpness, but intention. The flake is not just a blade, it is a beginning of a kind of mind that thinks not only of what is but of what could be. In every stone tool lies a trace of abstraction, a ghost of foresight. And that ghost was held in the hand, the same hand that had once gripped bark now broke bone, the same fingers that curled around twigs now curled around the future. Because a tool, even a simple one, is a statement. That this world can be changed, that this edge can cut, that this form can transform, that this hand, at last, has found its voice. And it spoke not in words, but in weight. In the grain of basalt, the fracture of obsidian, the angled pressure of percussion, these were the syllables of the first technology. Rudimentary, yes, but astonishingly deliberate. Each flake removed from a core stone was a syllable in a language of making, and the hand was its author. But a tool is never just a tool. It is a thought, externalized. It is memory, stored in matter. When Homo habilis struck one rock against another, they weren't just solving a problem, they were extending their mind into the world. They were offloading intent into form, and in doing so, they altered the terrain not only of their environment, but of their cognition. Because to use a tool is to anticipate, to look at a thing and imagine not what it is, but what it could be. This is the quiet origin of imagination, and it emerged not in fire or language, but in the soft clack of stone against stone. The freed hands began to sculpt not just objects, but ideas. Each blow carried an unspoken question. What if? What if this edge could slice sinew? What if this shard could open marrow? What if this world could be carved into new shapes? And so the hand became an intermediary between thought and matter. It received the pressure of need from the body, hunger, cold, injury, and returned with solutions chipped from stone. In that transaction, the mind grew more complex. Not all tools succeeded. Many broke. Many failed. But each attempt was a rehearsal for something deeper, abstraction. And where abstraction blooms, meaning follows. Consider the gesture. Before language rose in the throat, it bloomed in the fingers. A pointed hand, a beckon, a mimic of action. These were the first signals that crossed the gap between minds. Gesture is where thought leaves the self and enters the space between. It is not coincidence that the hands and the brain co-evolved in their complexity. The cortex expanded as the digits refined. We were not only walking upright, we were reaching forward. And in that reaching, our ancestors did something rare in the animal kingdom. They began to shape time. The making of a tool is the making of a future. It is preparation. It is a vote of confidence that the self will exist long enough to need what is made, and that future self, injured, cold, or hungry, will benefit from this moment's labour. This was more than survival. It was projection. It was care extended across hours or days. It was the idea that now could serve later, and in that idea something very human stirred. Because the hands, once curled for climbing, now curled in creation. They held not just the materials of the world, but the first shadows of meaning. Meaning at its core is a bridge between sensation and significance, and the hand, newly freed, became the first architect of that bridge. It learned to trace patterns in dust, to line pebbles along a river's edge, to imitate the curve of antelope horn in bent branches or bone. These were not yet symbols in the modern sense, but they were the quiet rehearsals for symbolic thought. Because to shape is to signify. Even the simplest older one tool holds more than function. Its shape tells a story, not just of utility, but of choice, of technique, of a mind rehearsing precision. Every nick and chip is a fossil of cognition, preserved in stone. These were not random strikes. They were iterations, practice, pattern, and through repetition, the hand began to internalize rhythm. Rhythm became memory. In time, tasks once laboured over became fluid. A hand could now move without the constant supervision of conscious thought. This freed the mind further, not to rest, but to roam, and in that freedom imagination stretched its limbs. The brain, no longer fully occupied by the body's every need, began to wonder, what else could this hand do? Could it twist sinew into rope? Could it carve not only meat, but message? Could it hold more than tools? Could it hold tenderness? The same fingers that chipped stone could now cradle an infant's head, could press reassurance into another's back, could mimic the shape of a predator in shadow gesture to warn the group. Each of these acts pulled the hand further from instinct and deeper into intention. And intention is the doorway to art. We have no cave paintings yet, no figurines tucked into rock crevices. But the capacity is forming. The neural networks for representation are being knit with every tool made, every gesture shared. In the silent spaces between the cracking of marrow and the stirring of embers, the hand began to dream. What would it mean to create not just for need, but for expression? To leave a mark that doesn't solve a problem but simply says, I was here. That question would echo for hundreds of thousands of years. But its origin lies here, in these primitive hands under a wide sky, testing the edges of their newfound freedom. For now, it is enough that they shape the world around them, that they reach across the gulf of speechless time to touch one another, that they begin to tell stories, not with words but with action, with the slow choreography of flint on flint, the calloused thumb pressing the future into being, hands no longer bound by survival alone, hands that remember what they have done, hands that imagine what they might do next. And this imagining, slow, halting, elemental, was not confined to tools alone. It spilled outward, into the very way our ancestors moved through space, through time, through one another's lives. A hand, once freed, became not just a manipulator of objects, but a carrier of culture. And culture, at its root, is memory shared. To pass on a technique, how to hold a stone, how to angle a strike, is to teach. And to teach is to recognize that knowledge can outlive the moment, can move from one body to another like fire catching on dry grass. This too is part of the hand's revolution. It became a vessel of transmission, a bridge from generation to generation. Picture it, an elder guiding a younger hand, fingers wrapped gently around wrist, adjusting the motion, not speaking, just showing. The rhythm passed not through language, but through contact. And in that contact, a deeper awareness formed, that this gesture matters, that this moment matters. The hand, in shaping stone, was also shaping minds, shaping social structures, expectations, even emotions. Because to teach is to trust. It requires patience. It requires presence. These early hominins were not simply surviving, they were beginning to live in shared time. And this, perhaps, is where manipulation becomes meaning, where utility spills into intimacy. A tool passed from one hand to another is not just an object, it is a statement. I believe you will need this. I believe you will understand. This act of giving, of offering, carries the first traces of empathy. The hand that offers is the hand that sees another as an extension of the self. It's a small miracle. From balance came gesture. From gesture came connection. And from connection, the beginnings of story. Because even in the absence of words, actions compose narratives. The chipped stone speaks of hunger, of danger, of resilience. The handprint left on a rock surface, simple, primal, says I existed. The fire-tending fingers say I protected. And so, meaning thickens. It begins to cling to things. It begins to linger. The hand, after all, is an expressive surface. It curls in grief. It extends in offering. It shakes with rage. It steadies in calm. And each motion, each stillness, adds to the repertoire of early symbolic life. What began as function became form. What began as survival became ritual. And what began as biology became identity. We are, in no small part, the creatures of our hands. They reflect us, project us, carry us. They are the outward face of our inner world, long before voices ever tried to catch up. And in that long silence before language, it was the hand that did the speaking. Not just in tools, but in touch, in making, in meaning. In that ancient dialogue between need and possibility, the hand stood at the threshold. Every chipped stone and every cautious gesture carved a path towards something larger than mere survival, a new kind of presence in the world. For the first time, the body did not only inhabit the landscape, it altered it, interpreted it, and eventually imagined beyond it. The freed hand became not just an agent of change, but of continuity, because it is through the hand that memory becomes tradition. The gestures of our ancestors, carefully turning over a flake, softly placing a tool in another's palm, are echoed in every craftsman's grip, every parent's guidance, every quiet exchange of an object with meaning. The past rests in our fingers more than in our minds. Even now, long after the forest gave way to fields and the savannas grew silent, we can feel that lineage stir when we create something from rawness, when a sculptor turns stone, when a baker kneads dough, when a parent cradles a child's hand in their own. These are not modern inventions, these are ancient echoes. The hand is where the world first met the imagination. It made external what was once internal. It proved that ideas could live outside the skull, in things that endured, things others could touch, examine, carry. And once ideas could live outside the body, they could live longer than the body. They could travel, they could evolve. This was the beginning of human culture. Not fire, not language, but the decision to make and to pass down what was made. And yet, none of this would have been possible without the upright stance that began it all. The balance of walking, the view from above the grass, the shift of weight through hips and spine, all of it conspired to release the hand from locomotion. A small anatomical change that rippled outward through time, unlocking a vast terrain of mental and social possibility. So we stand now, thousands of generations later, with hands that remember. They remember the forests we once clung to. They remember the stones we once struck. They remember the moments when gesture first became communication, when action first became meaning, when the future first took form in a flake of rock. We live inside those memories whether we realize it or not. In every clasp, every offering, every act of making, we continue that ancient conversation. We are not only descendants of upright walkers, we are heirs to the hands that freed themselves, and in their quiet, dexterous defiance of gravity's pull, they lifted us, one movement, one tool, one gesture at a time, into the boundless realm of thought. The foot lifts, the body shifts, and a rhythm begins, a quiet repetition carried across millions of years, linking us to a lineage that learned not only to walk, but to think while walking. To move upright was not merely a mechanical change, it was a transformation of perspective, of tempo, of what the mind could become when freed from the constant negotiation of branches, knuckle walking, and the unstable thresholds of four-limbed locomotion. When our ancestors stood, when they walked, they did more than travel across space. They began to move inward, into thought, into memory, into the early architecture of the human mind. What happens to a brain when it is asked to coordinate this delicate dance, step after step, through terrain that shifts with every season? What new neural patterns must arise to manage balance, direction, vigilance, and foresight, all at once, and all while the body remains upright, exposed, and forward-moving? Bipedal locomotion is not simply about muscles or bones. It is a test of the nervous system, a challenge issued to the brain to manage complexity in real time, with every stride. Each step demands calibration, each terrain invites prediction, and in these predictions, formed and reformed with each motion, lies the foundation of cognition. To walk upright is to plan, to assess the angle of a slope, to anticipate the shift of soil beneath the foot, to notice the arc of sun and the scent of distance. Our ancestors had to imagine not just the next footfall, but the one after that, and the one after that. They had to recall where water last pooled, where predators once circled, where roots tangled under dust. And as these needs repeated themselves across generations, the brain began to grow in response, not just in size, but in depth, in interconnection, in story. Because to walk, truly walk, is to move with memory, memory of terrain, memory of threat, memory of kin, and from memory comes imagination, the ability to simulate what might lie over the next rise, behind the tree line, beyond the river. It is no coincidence that the regions of the brain involved in movement and those involved in memory sit closely bound. They are part of the same rhythm, the same song played through the body, encoded in the way muscles flex and eyes scan and thoughts begin to wander. We call it a walk, but perhaps it was always more than that. Perhaps it was the first meditation. How many silent paths were traced by early hominins, their minds drifting into dream as their feet repeated ancient patterns? What emerged in those long hours beneath the sun, when no tool was needed, no danger was near, and the only sound was the whisper of wind and the gentle crunch of step after step? What does it mean that we still walk when we need to think? That the foot, lifting and landing, still draws ideas from the ground? This is no coincidence. It is an echo of an ancient cognitive choreography, one that shaped us long before writing, long before language. The very act of walking upright restructured our minds to become spatial, rhythmic, recursive. With each step, our ancestors engaged not only with their environment, but with an internal process of orientation and imagination. Wayfinding, the subtle art of remembering paths and predicting new ones, became a fundamental skill, and with it, the brain learned how to construct maps, not just of the world outside, but of thought itself. The hippocampus, that seahorse-shaped structure deep within the brain, evolved in part to meet this demand. In modern humans, it is central to both spatial navigation and episodic memory, but its evolutionary roots stretch back to the need to remember where food could be found, where safety waited, or where the landscape changed with the seasons. These weren't abstract puzzles, they were immediate, just as life-shaping realities. If a hominin could not remember, it could not return. If it could not predict, it could not survive. But as these pressures persisted, they began to foster something new. In tracing a remembered path, the brain also learned how to simulate a possible one, to imagine a shortcut, a safer detour, a route that could lead to something unseen, and this capacity for spatial abstraction, thinking of the world not just as it is but as it might be, became the foundation for other kinds of mental modelling. Eventually these same structures would help us imagine not only routes but outcomes, not only terrain but time, past, future, possibility. And thus, from walking came foresight. This is where locomotion bleeds into reflection. To walk is to give the mind space to rehearse, to recombine, to wander. And in that wandering, cognition deepens. Early hominins, following herds across vast plains or picking their way through tangled hillsides, weren't only surviving. They were learning the contours of thought. Their feet marked physical ground, but their minds were mapping something more elusive, a model of self, of cause and effect, of inner continuity. And so the path beneath their feet became a kind of teacher. Each journey pressed more pattern into memory. Each successful return reinforced the mental scaffolding that would later support complex ideas. These weren't just walkers. They were the early architects of narrative, of beginning, middle, and return. And in this recursive loop of movement and memory, the seeds of story were planted. Not because they sat and composed them, but because they walked them. Because every long walk was in some small way a rehearsal of story, a movement from where one is to where one might be, and all the mental steps it takes to imagine the distance between. This quiet revolution, where walking shaped thinking, did not happen suddenly. It unfolded slowly, like a path carved by countless feet over time. Each step wore a groove into the mind as much as into the earth. The pace of walking, deliberate and rhythmic, offered a rare alignment between body and brain. Unlike sprinting or climbing or fighting, acts that demand rapid bursts of attention, walking allowed for duration. It created space for repetition, for internal cadence, for reflection to unfold alongside motion. In this shared rhythm, something remarkable stirred. Consciousness began to stretch. To walk was to sequence time, one foot, then the next, one landmark, then the next. A distant goal, slowly drawn nearer. This rhythm, so deeply rooted in the body, gave the brain a natural framework for organizing experience. It allowed for pacing, for segmentation, for mental structure. Walking became not just a way to move, but a scaffold for thought itself. The world outside became a mirror for the mind within, and the journey across a savanna became the journey through an idea. Think of the early hominin tracing the same trail, day after day, watching the shadows fall in familiar places, noticing when the wind shifted or a new track appeared in the dust. This isn't just observation, it is the cultivation of awareness. To walk attentively is to witness change. To walk repeatedly is to understand pattern. And from pattern comes meaning. Our ancestors began to see the world not only as it was, but as it was becoming. Wayfinding matured into something more than navigation. It became the first dialogue with time. It taught the mind to compare present conditions with remembered ones, to anticipate how long a journey would take, to balance hunger against distance, to hold more than one possibility in the mind at once. And in that balancing act, in that emerging ability to manage contingencies and contradictions, cognition began to bend toward complexity. None of this needed language. It needed movement. It needed the slow, steady practice of going, of returning, of noticing. The walk itself taught patience, and patience is a fertile soil for imagination. When the body no longer needed to fight or flee, when it simply needed to move, endlessly, deliberately, attention had room to expand. It could wander without urgency, and in that wandering, ideas could form. Ideas about direction, about others, about the self. A landscape once filled only with threats and resources became something more, a canvas upon which inner life could unfold, and perhaps this is where the first philosophy began, not in speech, not in symbols, but in silence. In the long, sunlit hours of uninterrupted walking, where thought could rise like heat from the ground, shaped by no tool and bound by no language. Just the body, the earth, and the mind becoming aware of itself. In this early dialogue between motion and cognition, a kind of proto-consciousness was being sculpted, not in the sudden flash of insight, but in the repetition of quiet experience. The upright posture created a condition where the world could be seen continuously, and walking allowed that world to be experienced in a steady linear flow. It was the first form of narrative structure we ever knew, a beginning at one location, an unfolding through space and time, and an eventual return or arrival. Before there were myths, there were migrations. Before there were mantras, there were footfalls. The connection between walking and thinking is not poetic license. It is biological reality. Modern neuroscience has begun to uncover what our ancestors embodied, that rhythmic movement activates neural pathways involved in memory, creativity, and even emotional regulation. The act of walking stimulates bilateral coordination across the hemispheres, prompting crosstalk between brain regions responsible for language, spatial reasoning, and abstract thought. This suggests that the very motion of walking helped organize the brain's architecture. Even today, we walk to think. Writers walk to loosen ideas, philosophers pace, children wander in circles when solving problems aloud. This is not incidental. It is ancestral. It is the ghost of those first minds, deep in the savannah, finding coherence in motion. But there is something deeper still, something perhaps beyond science. Walking does not merely prompt thoughts, it grants them distance. In the time it takes to cross a landscape, thoughts can unfold without the pressure to be resolved. They can exist in fragments, drift like dust across the mind, and settle into form when ready. This slow unfolding mirrors the movement of the body, a trust that each step will carry you, that the rhythm will provide structure even when the direction feels uncertain. And isn't that the root of philosophy? Not the answers, but the willingness to move through questions without needing to arrive. The earliest hominins did not speak of meaning, but they moved with it. They felt it in the pull of a remembered path, in the tension between hunger and distance, in the curiosity of what lay just beyond view. Their cognition was not detached from the body. It was born within it, cradled by movement, stretched by terrain, refined by return. The upright body, with its freed hands and forward-facing gaze, became a vessel for the slow, contemplative work of becoming aware. And so the walker became the thinker, not by standing still and pondering, but by moving through the world with attention. In this act, thought was not a product. It was a rhythm, a process, a direction. It did not need to conclude. It only needed to continue, step by step, like a path unfolding beneath the sky, asking not for answers, but for presence. Presence. That is what walking gave to our ancestors. In a world of unpredictability, where a sudden rustle might signal predator or prey, presence was not optional. It was survival. But it was also something more subtle. It was the discipline of noticing. And in this noticing, a new kind of consciousness emerged. Not just of the outer world, but of the inner one, of moods shifting with weather, of thoughts echoing across landscapes, of selfhood trailing in the footprints behind. The Lutoli footprints in Tanzania, left over 3.6 million years ago by members of Australopithecus afarensis, remain one of the most haunting records of this presence. 3 individuals walking side by side through wet volcanic ash, their tracks fossilized by time and circumstance. The prints are not just evidence of bipedal motion, they are a record of attention, of coordination, of a shared moment between bodies moving together, not toward anything dramatic, but simply continuing forward. We do not know what they were thinking, but we know they were thinking, because walking requires it. Each print carefully placed hints at an ancient mental choreography, awareness of one another, of terrain, of pace. These were not random wanderers. They were walkers with memory, with foresight, with perhaps even a rudimentary sense of ritual, walking together, not alone, bound by invisible threads of relation. And here, in the quiet of fossilized ash, we glimpse the soul of what would become human philosophy, the practice of returning to one's thoughts through motion, the awareness that self and world are intertwined, not in stillness but in motion. That identity itself is shaped as much by where we walk as by what we believe. In this light, bipedalism is not just a trait, it is a worldview. It encourages continuity, it rewards perseverance, it nurtures the long thought, the idea that needs hours to ripen, that cannot be rushed, that must be felt in the body before it can be spoken aloud. And so from these ancient steps came the philosophers and the seekers, the monks pacing garden paths, the nomads reading wind, the poets walking city streets at dusk. The same impulse flows through all of them, a rhythm deeper than language, older than civilization, encoded in muscle and bone. Perhaps this is what it means to think like a human, not to sit apart from the world and reflect, but to move within it, slowly, attentively, rhythmically, carving paths through both space and self. And when the dust finally settles, and all the footsteps are erased by time, what remains is not just a journey completed. What remains is the shape of the mind that walked it, the memory not of where we went, but of how it felt to go. And in that memory, still echoing today in every solitary walk we take to gather our thoughts, the footprints of thought continue forward, soft, deliberate, and unbroken. Before it was a choice, migration was a pulse, a biological rhythm tuned to the landscape's shifting beat. Long before boats sliced through oceans or caravans traced silk into sand, the first great departure happened on foot, slowly, hesitantly, across a trembling earth that seemed to breathe and beckon with each season's change, and it began in Africa. This was not merely a continent, it was a womb of memory, of invention, of first fire and first laughter and first grief. But at some moment, in a span lost even to the oldest stories, some among us looked out beyond the known and stepped into the unknown. What happens when home itself becomes a horizon? The story of leaving Africa is not a single moment. It is a whisper stretched across millennia, a quiet dispersal driven not by conquest or ambition, but by hunger, by curiosity, by the slow erosion of certainty beneath one's feet. It begins with Homo erectus, one of our earliest ancestors to stand tall not just in anatomy, but in attitude. Over 1.5 million years ago, these upright walkers began to move beyond the Rift Valley, threading through woodlands and savanna, tracing riverbanks northward into the Levant, sweeping east into India and the islands of Southeast Asia. They did not know they were leaving anything behind. They only knew they were going. Why? What moves a species not once, but over and over again? across glaciers, deserts, monsoons, and mountains. What ancient longing laced itself into the soles of their feet? Perhaps it was not a reason, but a rhythm, an answer written in motion, not words. Migration, at its core, is not merely a path, it is a pattern. And Homo erectus followed it like a melody half-remembered, shaped by instinct but refined by endurance. Endurance was not optional. The routes were not mapped. The food was not guaranteed. Each step into unfamiliar territory exposed the body to new dangers, new climates, new predators. And yet the body adapted. Longer legs allowed for sustained movement. Narrower hips and more efficient sweating systems turned the skin into a canvas of resilience. The open plains offered no cover, but the upright form became an advantage. A walking lighthouse able to spot threats, read landscapes, and recognize a distant tree or landmark from across a valley. The brain, too, began to shift, not in size yet, but in orientation. A migrating mind is a mind in motion, planning, remembering, imagining. This was not a wave, it was a slow tide, and with each trickle of movement the world began to change. Bones left behind in Dmanisi, Georgia, over 1.75 million years ago, suggest a version of Homo erectus who had already adapted to life beyond Africa's familiarity. Tools followed the trail, simple flakes of stone shaped with care, carried across continents like thoughts made solid. What does it mean to carry not just yourself but an idea into a land no one you know has ever seen? Was it fear that drove them, or wonder, or are the two always walking side by side? Fear and wonder, the twin shadows cast by movement. One whispers caution, the other calls forward, and between them walks Homo erectus, neither reckless nor timid, but attentive. This was not a species leaping toward glory. This was a species feeling its way forward, one season at a time, one bend in the river at a time. The terrain was not simply landscape, it was teacher. Forests thinned and returned, rivers flooded and vanished, herds moved, rain fell or didn't, and the people followed. They followed the wind, they followed the tracks of hoof and claw, they followed the stars, perhaps not to navigate by them, but to dream beneath them. In these long walks, something changed in the way the world was seen. A migrating hominin could not afford to think only in the present moment. They had to remember that grove where fruit once ripened, that crossing where the river ran low, that cave that faced away from the wind. Memory became more than recall, it became strategy, and strategy became survival. The world was no longer a fixed place. It was a moving puzzle, a flowing map of choices and consequences. To walk it successfully, one had to begin thinking ahead. Here, we see how endurance gave rise to abstraction. Walking long distances demanded foresight, and foresight demanded a mind that could hold multiple versions of reality at once. The place where you are, the place where you've been, and the place you hope to find. The muscles adapted, yes, but so did imagination. Migration at its heart is an imaginative act. You do not walk unless you can picture something beyond the next hill. And what of those who stayed behind? Migration was never total. It was not a species evacuating, but branching. Some groups remained in Africa, while others moved outward. This created a diversity not just of form, but of worldview. Those who migrated had to contend with unfamiliar predators, climates, and foods. They met new materials, obsidian, bamboo, shell, and invented new ways of shaping them. Diets expanded, clothing evolved. Fire became more than warmth, it became culture, carried across landscapes like a shared secret. Every mile changed them, but the ache of separation likely followed, because migration is not just a beginning, it is also a leaving. Every step away from one landscape is a step further from the familiar rhythm of its days, the scents of particular trees, the shape of a particular mountain against evening light, the call of a bird whose meaning was once known. Even for a brain just beginning to form concepts of attachment, this dislocation may have carried a strange weight. And yet, still, they moved. Not because they knew what lay ahead, but because something inside them, call it necessity, call it instinct, call it an ancestral echo, said, "There is more, and the only way to find it is to go. So they went, across lowland savannas, through rising hills, over ridges carved by ice and rain. They walked through forests that pulsed with insect life, along shorelines traced by shellfish middens, and across steppes so wide they bent the horizon itself. The tempo was never hurried. Migration in deep time was not a sprint but a slow unfolding. One generation might only move a few dozen miles. But across centuries those footsteps stitched together vast distances, drawing invisible lines between continents, forming a quiet map beneath the sky. In this movement, adaptability was everything. The Earth, during these early migrations, was not a static backdrop. It was a shifting stage. Glaciers advanced and retreated. Sea levels rose and fell. Volcanic eruptions blanketed landscapes in ash. Entire ecosystems disappeared and reformed elsewhere. Those who survived weren't the strongest or the most aggressive. They were the most flexible. They could eat tubers or meat, hunt or scavenge, rest or keep moving. They learned to read the signs in weather and water. In this way, bipedalism wasn't just a physical change. It was the foundation of a new relationship with unpredictability. To walk on two legs is to make a wager that balance is possible, even in unstable times, and through this posture, something profound happened to the way early humans related to their environments. The vertical gaze lifted from the ground allowed them to see farther and to be seen. It fostered awareness beyond the immediate. A traveller scanning the horizon begins to think not just in terms of danger or safety, but of possibilities. Could there be a grove just beyond that ridge? A waterhole behind those trees? This speculative thinking, this curiosity stitched to caution, became a cognitive hallmark of migration. And it wasn't just individuals adapting, it was communities. Migration is not a solo endeavour. Even the smallest bands relied on cooperation to survive, sharing food, tending fire, watching for predators, carrying infants, all became part of a communal rhythm. Roles may have formed, agreements, gestures, calls, glances, new ways to coordinate movement. And slowly, across time, these bonds would deepen into something richer. Shared memory, shared purpose, shared direction. Walking, together, became a culture, not one defined by place, but by motion. And perhaps this is the paradox at the heart of early human migration. The more we moved, the more we became who we were. Stability was not our origin, it was our outcome. To walk was to adapt, and to adapt was to become. In this way, Homo erectus did not merely leave Africa. They carried Africa with them, its knowledge, its survival strategies, its rhythms, and rewrote them into each new landscape they encountered. So the story of early migration is not one of departure alone. It is the story of translation, of taking what was known and reshaping it to fit the unknown. And with each step, that translation became more fluent. The footprints of Homo erectus stretched farther still, into Southeast Asia, into the cold expanses of northern China, and eventually across island chains that would one day lead all the way to Oceania. By the time this species reached places like Java, nearly 1.5 million years had passed since the earliest ancestors stood hesitantly on African soil. Yet those long strides, measured in centuries, not days, still carried the imprint of their origin. In Java, fossilized remains whisper fragments of their presence, skull caps buried in riverbeds, stone tools lying silent beneath layers of volcanic ash. These were not accidental visitors. They were skilled navigators of change. The tools they carried and the shelters they sought show us beings who had become experts at enduring what others could not. They crossed ecological boundaries, tropical, temperate, even near-Arctic zones, not by force, but by attentiveness. They listened to the land. It was not migration in the modern sense. No borders, no maps, no destinations. But it was migration in its most primal form, movement as life, motion as meaning. This reveals something subtle but powerful. Migration wasn't just an adaptation to physical environment. It became an adaptation to uncertainty itself. To move forward without knowing what lies ahead is to enter into a relationship with ambiguity. And in that space, the human mind begins to expand, not simply to react, but to wonder. Each strange new terrain offered lessons. Some were learned through fire, others through loss. But each added another thread to the growing web of knowledge being spun across continents. And in this web there are quiet truths. One of them is this: migration makes memory long. A species that travels must carry more than food or tools. It must carry stories, where the water was last time, where the predators hunt, what trees bloom in which season. These are not things stored in individual minds alone. They are passed across generations. Migration may have been the pressure that shaped not only intelligence, but culture. Not only tools, but teaching. Language, at least in its earliest form, may have bloomed under this pressure. Perhaps not with complex grammar or long conversations, but with gesture, tone, rhythm, a pointing hand, a warning sound, a shared gaze. Because when you are moving together, what you know must also move. And still, the path was not always forward. Glaciers returned, climates shifted again, populations rose and collapsed. Some branches of early humans disappeared entirely, their migration stories ending in silence. But others endured, and in this continuity a deeper pattern began to emerge. Migration, once survival, began to resemble something else, something older than intention and deeper than instinct. A calling, not a voice or a command, but a pull, toward what was not yet known, toward the horizon, toward possibility, toward the open. And in that openness, something even more profound began to take root. The walker, once merely a survivor, was becoming a thinker, because the act of migration required more than muscles and maps. It required a growing internal landscape. The outward journey carved pathways in the brain just as surely as it did across the earth. Pathways for memory, for speculation, for hope. To walk forward was to hold multiple timelines in the mind at once: what has been, what is, and what might be. And so walking became, quite literally, the pace of thought. Each step a small beat in a larger rhythm, a metronome for a species beginning to link endurance with imagination. This is not metaphor. Neuroscience today tells us that walking stimulates regions of the brain associated with memory, creativity, and planning. In deep time, this rhythm may have shaped not just how early humans survived, but how they began to dream. Moving bodies gave rise to moving minds. This was the legacy of bipedalism, echoing across continents. Standing upright gave our ancestors visibility. Migration gave them vision. And in between the lifted head and the unknown path, came a new sense of self. The early walkers may not have had names or maps or borders, but they were beginning to form something else, a species-wide intuition that the world was not only a place to survive in, but to explore. That time was not only something to endure, but to traverse. That distance, though daunting, was also invitation. That intuition is still with us. It lingers in the way we stand when we look at the ocean, in the quiet restlessness that stirs when seasons change, in the stories we tell about faraway lands and the longing we feel for places we've never been. In airports and hiking trails, in memory and myth, the long migration didn't end. It became us. We are the descendants of walkers, of those who risked movement over comfort, who traded certainty for discovery, who stepped into landscapes not yet named and made them home, and even now, in the shape of our feet, in the curve of our hips, in the way our heads balance atop our spines, there is evidence of that journey. The story of our migration is not just in maps or fossils, it is in our posture, our curiosity, our capacity for awe. And so the long migration continues, not always as physical travel, but as movement of mind, of imagination, of connection. Because perhaps to be human is not to arrive, it is to journey, to follow the flicker of something just ahead, a glint of water, a bend in the trail, a thought. Something that calls, not loudly, but insistently, from the edge of what we know. And so we walk, still. The farther they walked, the more they carried, not just in their arms, not only on their backs, but in their bodies, in ligaments stretched across the seasons, in joints worn smooth by repetition, in muscle systems repurposed for a life that no longer paused. Bipedalism, That elegant and improbable choice made somewhere deep in evolutionary time had begun as a trade. 2 legs, upright vision, hands freed for tool-making, gesture and expression. But it was not without cost. The farther our ancestors travelled from the forests of their origin, the more acute the toll became. Cold set in. Distances widened. The grasslands stretched into steppe, into plain, into the far and empty between. What happens to a species when survival means never settling? When hunger is not a moment but a climate? When the horizon is not a promise but a requirement? Energy became a sacred currency. Every step weighed against the day's heat. The bodies burn, the hunger gnawing beneath the ribs. Evolution, ever the quiet accountant, began to fine-tune the body to this pilgrimage. The pelvis narrowed and rotated. The spinal column curved into its familiar S, cushioning the rhythmic impact of a walking stride. The gluteal muscles thickened not for sitting, but for balance, for propulsion. The long tendons of the legs, especially the Achilles, became springs for locomotion, conserving energy with each return to ground. Every adaptation whispered the same message: forward, forward, forward. Yet balance is not only anatomical, it is psychological, social, existential. With each new environment came a new equation. How far could one travel without falling behind? How could a group move together without fracturing? The distance was not merely between watering holes, but between lives. The strong and the weak, the fast and the slow, the young and the aging. To be human was no longer just to move, it was to carry. And so the burden became shared. We find its early traces not just in bones, but in behaviour, traced through the fossilised wear of joints, the healed fractures on the elderly, the patterns of care encoded in the archaeology of shelters and sites. In Homo erectus, we see a pelvis designed for long strides, but also evidence of extended parental investment. In Homo heidelbergensis, we find communities burying their dead, perhaps mourning, perhaps marking time. These are not just markers of biology, they are signs of something else emerging, an ethic of endurance. How does a creature keep going, not just alone, but together? The answer, as always, is hidden in hardship. The colder the climate, the more pressing the need to huddle. The scarcer the food, the more important the sharing. Where one fell, another knelt. Where one wept, another noticed. And in that noticing, fleeting, fragile, profound, something new took root. Empathy did not descend from the heavens. It rose from the dirt, from cracked feet and quiet grief. From the long and lonely road beneath an open sky. To survive such a road required more than strength. It required sensitivity, a subtle attunement to the states of others, a watching of eyes, a listening for breath, a recognition of when someone lagged, not out of laziness, but from pain. Emotional intelligence in this context was not a luxury. It was a lifeline. And slowly, over generations, this capacity deepened. To walk together across a world that offered little meant that relationships could no longer be merely incidental. They had to be intentional. Trust became a structure just as important as bones. The group became a body of its own, its limbs spread wide but always listening inward for signs of rupture or need. The burden of distance made cooperation essential, and in making it essential it made it sacred. Evidence of this transformation is not loud. It's not found in monuments or manuscripts, but in subtler signals. A healed femur that should have killed its owner without months of immobility. A child's remains nestled beside those of elders. Where patterns in teeth and tools that show an older individual was fed, long past the age of useful work. These are the quiet footprints of care, etched not in soil but in survival itself. The long migration demanded not just motion, but meaning. This demand shaped our bodies further. Shoulders became more flexible, adapted not only for throwing tools, but for cradling infants. Our hands grew precise, yes, for crafting, but also for holding, feeding, cleaning. Human skin became one of our most important sensory organs, not just for detecting temperature, but for social touch. The ability to soothe, to comfort, to connect. The cold only amplified this need. In unfamiliar climates, arid winds, snow-covered plains, high mountain passes, physical vulnerability increased. Fur was no longer an option. Our species, now largely hairless, faced exposure head-on, and yet, despite this apparent disadvantage, we endured. How? Through fire, through clothing, through huddling, through the capacity to recognize need and respond to it with invention and intention. We became intelligent not in spite of hardship, but because of it. And much of that intelligence was social. It is no coincidence that in the archaeological record the signs of advanced tool use often appear alongside evidence of group interaction. Not simply because one person made the tool and another used it, but because tools passed hands. Ideas were shared, skills were taught, learning became communal. And communal learning required empathy, patience, and memory. In this way, the long journey across vast distances gave birth to something extraordinary, a mind not just tuned to the self, but to the other. This widening of awareness, this extension of the self into the shared, was not always seamless. Conflict still erupted, resources remained finite. But even within the tension, evolution was at work, rewarding not only aggression or cunning, but kindness. Because kindness, when conditions demand collaboration, becomes adaptive. And so, even as the winds howled and the land grew strange, something quietly warmed within us. Not fire in the literal sense, though fire too was vital, but a deeper ember. A capacity to endure not through isolation, but through presence, through touch, gaze, gesture. We did not walk alone, and that changed what walking meant. Each footfall became a silent agreement with those beside us. I will stay near, I will notice, I will help. Such bonds were tested often. Crossing new terrain exposed our ancestors to countless trials. In high-altitude regions, oxygen thinned. In dense forests, direction faltered. In arid deserts, the mirage of water promised relief it couldn't deliver. And across these shifting landscapes, balance became everything. Not only literal balance, the coordination of muscles and limbs, but emotional balance, the resilience to continue despite loss, fatigue, or fear. Anatomy reveals how this balance evolved. The semicircular canals in the inner ear, vital for spatial orientation, became finely tuned for upright movement across uneven terrain. The foot evolved a robust arch, not only to absorb a shock, but to rebound energy, propelling the body forward with each step. The human gait is not just a function of legs, it is a symphony of bones and nerves, a rolling cadence built to traverse worlds, and behind it, always the brain, ever recalibrating, sensing, adapting. But even a perfect gait cannot outpace despair. Loneliness too is an evolutionary force, in the long dark stretches of unbroken steppe, or during brutal winters when the sun lingered only briefly. The emotional weight of distance could become crushing. Those who felt deeply, who longed for others, who sought comfort in touch or word, these individuals were not weak, they were necessary. For their longing drew the group back together. Their sadness signalled the need for closeness. In this way, vulnerability itself became a form of communication. We see the effects of this in the emergence of ritual, of symbolic burial, of markings left on cave walls, of gatherings around hearths. These were not simply practical behaviours. They were efforts to knit together meaning in the face of difficulty, to say, in gesture and symbol, you are not alone, to say, this matters, you matter. It was in this crucible of hardship that emotional intelligence began to mature. The brain grew not only in size but in connectivity. Neural pathways linking emotion, memory and decision-making became more sophisticated. Mirror neurons, those which fire both when we act and when we see others act, may have played a role in this growing sensitivity. We began to feel in ourselves what others felt, and through that mirroring, compassion deepened. This capacity changed the stakes of distance, because now, when someone fell behind, it wasn't only a logistical problem, it was an emotional wound, a tear in the social fabric that the group would work to mend. In this way, resilience became not just physical endurance but relational strength. We survived not just because we could walk far, but because we could walk back for the injured, back for the young, back for the elders whose steps had slowed, but whose memories anchored the group in stories, locations, and lessons hard won. It was this capacity to reverse course, not only geographically but emotionally, that gave early humans an extraordinary resilience. In the face of distance, they chose not abandonment, but return. This act of circling back would come to define the very nature of human society. Across continents and generations, it would appear again and again. In the gathering of wood for another's fire, in the quiet preparation of food for someone too weak to forage, in the embrace of grief when someone was lost. These are not merely acts of care, they are evolutionary landmarks, just as significant as a bipedal gait or an opposable thumb. At the biological level, these behaviours reshaped us. Oxytocin, often called the bonding hormone, played a growing role in our neurochemistry. It rewarded closeness, eye contact, synchronized movement. Its presence in group behaviour helped reinforce bonds under stress. Our stress responses, fight, flight, or freeze, began to be tempered by something older and deeper, the impulse to soothe, to huddle, to touch. This biochemistry worked in tandem with physical change. The human face, for instance, became more expressive. Muscles beneath the skin, especially around the eyes and mouth, allowed for a wide range of emotional signalling. A glance could communicate alarm. A softening of the eyes could convey reassurance. These were not trivial developments. They were vital tools in the emotional toolkit of a species learning to walk far together. And with distance came memory. To travel long distances and survive, our ancestors had to remember not only the path, but what happened along it, where food had been found, where predators lurked, where shelter had offered refuge. These memories were not stored in isolation. They were shared through stories, gestures, reenactments. Around fires and beneath stars, memory became narrative, and narrative in turn became culture. Culture is, in many ways, the memory of a group walking. It stores the burdens so they do not weigh solely on the individual. It holds lessons in symbols, in rituals, in songs, and through culture, distance becomes less lonely. It becomes legible. A known story rather than a silent expanse. But distance still asks a price. For every mile gained, something must be let go, whether a former home, a fallen companion, or a phase of life now past. The walk forward is also a walk through grief. And yet it is within this sorrow that something quietly luminous persists. The knowledge that one's journey matters more when shared. This, perhaps more than anything, defines the burden of distance. Not that it tests our strength, but that it reveals the shape of our heart. A heart not content to survive alone, but compelled, again and again, to reach for another. Even when the road stretches endlessly ahead. Even when the cold presses in. Because we are not a species of isolation. We are a species of tethering, one body to another, one story to the next. Our ancestors crossed vast lands, not as solitary wanderers, but as a constellation of steps, each bound to another, each footfall echoing a deeper rhythm of connection. And though the path was often brutal, the very difficulty of it carved into our being something durable, something luminous. We learned, in the face of distance, to carry more than tools or fire. We learned to carry each other. This burden, the emotional gravity of being responsible for another, did not weaken us. It refined us. It made us slower in some ways, yes, more cautious, more reflective, but it also made us deeply adaptive, a species that does not simply endure, but transforms adversity into memory, hardship into meaning. Through the lens of evolution, this is astonishing. Most animals adapt through changes in muscle, bone, or fur. We adapted too, but also through story, gesture, attention. Where distance punished the lone, it favoured the bonded. Those who could feel what others felt, who could carry not just a bundle of dried meat or sharpened stone, but the emotional weight of sorrow or fear. These were the ones who thrived, and the environment, for all its harshness, became our silent co-author. It asked everything of us: endurance, creativity, compassion. In return, it offered moments of rare grace. The sun rising over an unfamiliar ridge, the laughter of children beside a river none had ever seen, the stillness after a storm when the world held its breath and the group knew, wordlessly, that they had made it, again, through the night. These are not just survival moments, They are moments of becoming. For every challenge that distance threw at us, hunger, exposure, grief, we answered with ingenuity, ritual, and care. We developed songs to pass the time, games to teach skills, myths to make sense of the terrifying and the unknown. And in each of these the mind reached forward, creating not just tools or shelters, but frameworks of hope. That hope, quiet and persistent, is perhaps the most human trait of all. It says, there is something ahead, something worth reaching, even when tired, even when aching, even when doubting. And when we walk together, hope becomes collective. It no longer depends on one individual's strength, but on the group's shared direction. This, then, is the legacy of distance, not simply the lands we crossed or the fossils we left behind, but the invisible architecture of empathy, built step by step across generations. A trail of care etched not in stone, but in gesture, in memory, in the way we still, even now, pause when someone falls behind, not because it is efficient, but because it is human, and because long ago, in the cold and endless miles of prehistory, we discovered that survival was never just about the strongest. It was about those who chose to walk back. In the hush between footsteps, something began to form, a murmur of memory, a glimmer of a meaning. As our ancestors crossed open valleys and followed winding riverbeds, their feet carved more than tracks into the dust. They carved meaning. The upright gait, once a simple matter of anatomy, had become something else entirely, a pattern of movement echoing through the mind. Bipedalism did more than lift the head. It invited a kind of reflection, a rhythm of perception. Every journey left behind not only prints, but impressions, on the world, and on the minds of those who walked it. What happens when movement becomes memory? The answer, perhaps, flickers in the glow of the fire. Imagine a circle of figures, thin-boned, ash-smudged, lit by the flickering orange pulse of embers. They have travelled far together. Their legs ache, but their minds are alert, and now, as meat sizzles on flat stones and shadows stretch long into the night, one of them begins to speak. Not in language as we know it, but in tone, in gesture, in rhythm. A grunt becomes a symbol, a gesture becomes a trail, and soon the day's journey is being replayed, not just as recollection, but as performance. The path becomes a narrative, and the narrative becomes a thread between minds. This, it seems, is where culture begins, not with a monument or a painting, but with motion transcribed into meaning. Walking, thinking, remembering, telling. The act of migration fertilized the soil of cognition. It's no coincidence that the first clues of oral tradition are found not in sedentary settlements, but in transient bands, roaming, enduring, surviving together. Mobility demands communication. A group on the move must agree, on direction, on dangers, on time. Without shared stories, the path disintegrates into confusion. With them, it becomes a legacy. What good is a direction, after all, if it cannot be shared? And so the trail becomes collective. The bends in the river, the ridge where predators lurk, the cave with last season's scent of warmth. Each becomes a character in the growing tale of the group. A place is not just a location. It is an event, a lesson, a warning. Over time, these spatial memories deepen. They begin to anchor identity. We are the ones who crossed that pass. We remember the hunger at the dry gorge. We do not go where the lightning split the tree. Such phrases echo through generations, passed from firelight to firelight, until the terrain itself becomes alive with meaning. But what does it take to carry a story, when you carry everything else on your back? What kind of mind is required to hold not only tools and children and memories, but the idea of a journey, threaded across days, weeks, seasons? The emergence of symbolic thought, so often marked by tools and carvings, may just as well be marked by this, the moment when experience was no longer trapped in the moment, when it could be lifted, shaped and passed on, a portable past sewn into breath. Could it be that our first literature was lived, not written? The human voice, rising over the pop of burning wood, was once a map drawn in air. And perhaps even now, Beneath every tale we tell, there is still the echo of feet moving steadily forward. Because the cadence of a story, its rise and fall, its rhythm and pause, mirrors the pace of walking. The body in motion breathes in cycles, and the mind, syncing with this rhythm, begins to arrange experience accordingly, not as a stream of random stimuli, but as a sequence, a beginning, a middle, an end, a trail. And this instinct to shape time and space into something coherent became one of our species' most enduring tools. Even today, we speak of plot lines and narrative arcs as if the story were a path that can be walked. We follow a story, we trace its origins, we reach a conclusion. The metaphors of movement are not incidental, they are ancient. They reflect the neurological imprint of countless generations who found their orientation, physically and cognitively, through movement. Wayfinding wasn't just about remembering landmarks, it was about encoding them with meaning. A stand of trees becomes a site of refuge. A fork in the trail becomes a symbol of choice. Over time, these markers evolve. They lose their specificity and take on metaphorical weight. The bend in the river becomes a turning point in a tale. The mountain pass becomes an ordeal overcome. The dry season becomes exile. The first spark of this symbolic transformation lives in the mind that walks and remembers. What's remarkable is how much of this took place without writing. Long before glyphs were carved into bone or pigment brushed onto cave walls, humans were already curating a vast oral archive. This wasn't mere data storage. It was emotional, communal, living. A way for memory to move, not only across landscapes, but across generations. The spoken word, ephemeral and fragile, proved resilient in a way no artifact could. It adapted, it breathed, it evolved, and it brought people closer. Because to tell a story is to invite someone into your perception. It is a gesture of inclusion, a moment of mutual focus. Around the fire, when the journey paused, the storytellers wove shared memory into a net of coherence, so that the young would know what the old had seen, and the absent would remain present through tale. Each narrative became a thread in a vast invisible web, where danger was named, where rituals were formed, where ancestors whispered through voice. And yet, the earliest stories were not just about what had happened. They were about what could happen. Imagination was the extension of memory. Once the mind could recall what was, it could begin to simulate what might be. And so, walking, with its quiet repetitions and long silences, became fertile ground not only for remembering but for wondering, for patterning thought into possibility, for envisioning the hunt before it began, for rehearsing loss, triumph, reunion. The path stretched not only backward, into memory, but forward, into prophecy, into dream. This capacity, to hold the unseen in mind and to express it, was a revolution. A cognitive migration as profound as any physical one. And it all began with feet on the earth and breath in the chest. These simple rhythms, step, breath, glance, pause, formed the metronome of the early human mind. Unlike the sudden leaps of flight or the jolts of predator ambush, walking offered something different: duration, continuity. It gave thought the space it needed to unfold, and in that space something strange and delicate emerged: reflection. The walker could replay what had been and consider what might be. And this mental movement, looping back, reaching forward, found its mirror in the shape of story. We often think of narrative as a cultural achievement, but perhaps it is first and foremost a biological one, a byproduct of endurance, a necessity of coordination. When humans began to migrate, over plains, along coastlines, across mountains, they encountered more than terrain. They encountered time stretched across distance. Days and weeks of walking meant that minds had to stretch too, to retain goals, to anticipate outcomes. To remember where water was, to imagine what lay beyond the next hill. In these conditions, stories became more than entertainment. They became tools of survival. Knowledge had to travel as far as bodies did. A child needed to know which berries were safe. A sibling needed to understand the signs of an approaching storm. A partner needed to remember where the lions drank. And yet, information without emotion is easily forgotten. It is story, anchored in character, steeped in consequence, that preserves knowledge through feeling. Your uncle went there and never came back. She found the cave by following the stars. The spirits wait in the rocks. These are not just facts. They are narratives sculpted for memory. The symbolic layer thickened, and with it so did the sense of self. For to place yourself in a story, to be the one who walked or waited or witnessed, is to recognize your role in something larger. It is to form identity not merely from biology, but from continuity. I am one of those who crossed the river. I am the child of the one who climbed the ridge. Lineage becomes legend, and legend becomes map. Around the fire, these stories did more than pass the time. They bound the listeners together. They created a shared past, even among those who had not lived it directly. The footprints on the earth faded quickly, but the footprints in memory endured, and with each retelling they pressed deeper. It is in this way that bipedalism, not just the movement, but the experience of moving, becomes the unlikely root of culture. Not because it freed the hands, though it did. Not because it lifted the eyes, though it did, but because it allowed the mind to drift, to connect moment to moment, place to place, memory to metaphor. Walking, as an embodied habit, became a mental practice, and that practice became a tradition. Even now, when we walk alone and let our minds wander, we reenact this ancient habit. The rhythm of thought is still tied to the rhythm of steps. A footpath becomes a sentence. A turn in the trail becomes a change in tone. We think by moving forward. And the stories we told did too. They flowed like paths through memory, twisting, circling, branching, and slowly something deeper took shape. These stories didn't just explain where we had been. They began to ask why. Why does the rain come? Why does death follow age? Why do stars move across the sky? These weren't questions of survival. They were questions of meaning. And in the act of asking them, walking became something more than locomotion. It became philosophy in motion. The path now was not just physical, it was mythic. Many early narratives likely followed the same structure as the journeys that birthed them: departure, ordeal, return. These three movements, so universal in both landscape and life, came to echo through countless oral traditions. The hunter leaves the group. The danger is faced. The home is found again. This is not mere storytelling convention. It is neurological rhythm, shaped by the cadence of motion, mirrored in the shape of memory. The very structure of a footstep, lift, move, land, resonates in the tales we tell. And within these tales, memory itself began to take on new roles. Some became warnings, others became origins, and others still were used to encode more abstract truths: cosmic order, kinship lines, moral consequences. In this way, the stories around early fires were not just records of what was. They were experiments in what might be true. They tested ideas, shaped behaviour, reinforced group bonds. The fire, then, was more than warmth. It was a theatre. Here, voices stretched, faces flickered in amber light, words rose like smoke into the dark. In these moments, the upright mind extended itself across time and space, not only remembering, but imagining. And as imagination deepened, so too did empathy. To follow a character through struggle is to feel that struggle as your own. To hear of loss is to anticipate your own grief. To learn of love is to understand longing. Storytelling made emotion portable, shareable. It unified the internal and the communal, and perhaps that's why so many ancient myths begin with a journey, a trek through shadow, across wilderness, towards some distant and mysterious end. It echoes the migrations that shaped us. It mirrors the steps that taught us endurance. In a way, every great story is simply a memory of the first stories, those told when the stars were unfamiliar, when every footprint meant something, when the earth itself was the only text we could read. But even as the stories evolved, their origin remained encoded in the act of walking. Because movement is what allowed early humans to string moments together into meaning. The footsteps became memory. The memory became tale. The tale became culture. and from culture emerged the first glimmers of what we now call history. Not written, not yet, but spoken, embodied. Walked. In this way, bipedalism gave rise not just to hands and tools, not just to vision and vigilance, but to narrative, and through narrative, to self-awareness. We told stories, and eventually, we realized we were in one. This realization was profound, because once you see yourself as part of a story, you begin to see time differently. No longer are you just a creature reacting to seasons, to danger, to hunger. You become a narrator, a witness, a custodian of memory. And in the slow repetition of footsteps over ground, in the pauses between firelit sentences, humanity became more than biological. We became historical. This was not an abrupt transformation. It unfolded across generations. It whispered itself into the minds of children listening at their parents' knees, into the eyes of elders watching constellations shift, into the rhythm of shared song rising with morning smoke. Walking gave us time to remember. Fire gave us space to reflect, and story became the thread that bound it all together. We began to name the places we passed, to assign meanings to them. A hill might be sacred, a spring might be haunted, a plain might be remembered for a battle or a birth. Each feature of the land became a verse in the collective poem of a people. This is the birth of mythogeography, the fusing of narrative with terrain. The landscape itself became storied. Paths weren't just practical anymore. They became symbolic, pilgrimage, return, exile, home. These ideas did not arise after writing. They preceded it. Long before symbols were scratched into stone or inked onto parchment, they were spoken into the air and carried in muscle memory. A father might say, "We will travel as your grandfather did." A mother might whisper, "That rock holds the voice of our dead." These are not fictions. They are mappings of meaning onto space. In them, we see the early scaffolding of ritual, the seedbed of religion, the skeletal frame of poetry, and they are rooted, always, in movement. Because walking is not just how we got from one place to another. It is how we learn to hold the past within us, to plan for a future beyond instinct, to teach without touching. It's a small miracle. That upright posture, born of biomechanical chance, led to the flowering of symbolic thought. That through the long arc of migration, minds took shape that could dream, remember, and mourn. Even now we carry this lineage in our bodies. We speak of life as a path, of choices as crossroads, of death as a final journey. These are not just metaphors. They are fossil imprints left by millions of years of footsteps. Every story we tell still bears their trace. So next time you walk, slowly, rhythmically, without urgency, listen. Not to the noise of the world, but to the ancient cadence beneath your thoughts. The mind, set in motion by the body, still moves in that old way, still wanders, still weaves, still remembers that once, long ago, a species stood upright and began to speak of where it had been. We stand tall. We carry the past in our bones. Every step we take across the linoleum floor, every stretch upward to reach a cabinet, every hour spent shifting in an office chair beneath the weight of a tired spine, these are echoes. Not of machines or modern cities, but of long-forgotten plains, of dry grass whispering beneath the sun, of a creature who once looked across the savannah and chose to rise. Why did we begin to walk on two legs? That question may seem distant now, buried in sediment and fossils, but the answer lingers in the quiet pain of a lower back after a long day, in the complex geometry of a pelvis shaped not for comfort, but compromise, in the miracle and the danger of birth. Bipedalism, the defining adaptation of our lineage, was not a clean success. It was a gamble with consequences, an unfinished negotiation between evolution and gravity. And even now, millions of years later, our bodies still carry its terms. But what were those terms exactly? What did we trade in order to walk upright? Look to the spine, a marvel of engineering but one strained by verticality. Shaped originally for horizontal life in the trees, the vertebral column was twisted, stretched, and forced into an elegant S-curve to support the head above and the hips below. The result allowed balance, freed the hands, opened vistas, but it also invited compression. Discs bulged, Nerves pinched. The very posture that defined our success became the source of a uniquely human pain. Lower backache, the silent toll of our ascent. Then the pelvis, a cradle of compromise, narrow enough to permit upright locomotion but broad enough, barely, to allow for childbirth. This dual demand produced a delicate anatomical equation. Our ancestors paid the price in labour, difficult, dangerous, prolonged. Unlike other mammals, human infants are born unfinished, their skulls soft and pliable, their development incomplete. Why? Because to be born too large was fatal. Evolution had to draw the line somewhere, so it split the difference. Birth became the first crucible of human cooperation. From that crucible emerged not just individuals, but communities. The pain of upright birth gave rise to midwives, to shared knowledge, to maternal networks. Standing upright didn't just strain the body, it pulled people closer together. It demanded care. It taught us, from our very first breath, that survival was never solitary. But was this trade-off inevitable? Was the cost of walking always so high? Perhaps not. Some adaptations followed. The arch of the foot evolved to absorb shock. The gluteus maximus grew into a stabilizing force, not merely aesthetic but essential. Our knees locked in place to conserve energy, allowing us to stand still, to speak, to labour. Yet none of these adjustments were perfect. We still fall. We still stumble. We still feel the ancestral ache of an upright frame designed not by blueprint, but by compromise, mistake, and necessity. And in that design, flawed and brilliant, we glimpse something more than biology. We glimpse intention. We glimpse identity. What does it mean to carry a burden so ancient we've forgotten we're carrying it? What else have we forgotten simply because we learned to endure it? We forget that we're walking on the edge of an evolutionary question still being answered. Standing upright, for all its sophistication, is not a finished design, it is a work in progress. Every part of our posture is a quiet compromise, a story mid-sentence. The burden of balance is not just physical, but metaphorical. We stand between worlds, past and present, animal and mind, instinct and foresight. And in the tension of that posture we find ourselves. Evolution did not sculpt us into graceful statues. It jury-rigged a vertical animal out of a horizontal blueprint. To walk upright meant realigning muscles that once pulled for climbing. It meant changing the tilt of the foramen magnum, the hole through which the spine connects to the skull, so that the head could rest above the body rather than in front of it. It meant shaping hips to hold weight differently and knees that bent inward for balance. These weren't grand innovations. They were small, slow recalibrations, and the recalibrations never stopped. Our gait still wobbles when tired. Our arches collapse. Our joints grind. The human form is not perfectly adapted to standing. It is merely good enough. The upright posture we take for granted is less a finished product than a daily negotiation. Stand too long, and your lower back aches. Sit too long, and circulation suffers. Walk too far without preparation, and blisters form. We are not the end goal. We are a moment in motion. Yet somehow, this unfinished posture came to define our image of completion. In art, in architecture, in identity, we exalt the upright figure. We carve statues that stand tall and still, bodies perfected in symmetry and poise. In mirrors, we correct ourselves, pull our shoulders back, lift the chin, chase the silhouette of our imagined perfection. But that silhouette is not a truth. It's an aspiration. The real body tells a more vulnerable story, and that story matters, because to walk upright is to expose the body. No longer protected by the canopy or hidden in tall grass, the vertical figure becomes a signal. It reveals, it speaks. The way we stand expresses not just health, but emotion. Posture is language. A slumped back whispers fatigue. A lifted chin suggests pride or defiance. A turned-in foot, a swayed spine, a subtle limp. Each betrays something about the life inside the form. We became interpretable, readable, seen. This visibility shaped our psychology. It taught us to perform, to posture, to present ourselves to others. And it wove our self-image into our carriage. Shame pulls us down. Confidence lifts us. Love softens our stance. Fear stiffens it. Our posture became a mirror not just of structure, but of soul. And still, we remain unfinished. Even now, evolution continues its experiment. Injuries shape future generations. Medical interventions affect survival. Technology changes how we move, or whether we move at all. We sit more, walk less. In the modern world, the gift of upright motion is often deferred, its benefits dulled by comfort, its burdens intensified by design. And yet we still stand, still try, still carry the ancient momentum forward. Because somewhere within us, beneath the pain and the pressure, is a memory older than thought. To rise, again and again, is to be human. And yet, as we rise, we inherit more than just a posture. We inherit a paradox. Evolution gave us an upright form that allowed for vision, endurance and gesture. But it also gave us fragility. Our bones are slender compared to other primates, our spines vulnerable, our pelvises constrained. Walking upright was never meant to be painless. It was meant to be possible. And in that slim margin of possibility, our entire history unfolded. Consider the simple act of walking, a series of forward-falling steps caught at the last moment by the swing of a leg. It is a balancing act, literally, a controlled toppling, a perpetual catching of oneself. Every step is a confession of instability, and yet we master it by repetition, by trust, by the quiet rhythm of muscle memory. No one thinks about walking until walking falters, and when it does, when a joint seizes or a hip wears down, we feel the full cost of that evolutionary bet. But walking is more than biomechanics. It is memory, embedded in muscle and mind. The way we move through space reflects our inner architecture. The sway of the arms, the cadence of the feet, the subtle dip of the head, all carry emotional resonance. Grief walks differently than joy. Anticipation leans forward. Anxiety shortens the stride. To walk upright is to reveal, unconsciously, the story we carry. This connection between body and identity runs deep. Our posture shapes how we are perceived and how we perceive ourselves. A child learning to stand mirrors not just physical development, but cognitive awakening. The world looks different from above. The eyes find new horizons. The hands become tools of intention. Uprightness is not just a new vantage point, it's a new self. And that self becomes social. The upright figure demands acknowledgement. It is seen across distance, silhouetted against sky and grass. It gestures, communicates, invites. Uprightness is theatrical. It gathers attention. It commands presence. In this way, bipedalism altered more than anatomy. It restructured the dynamics of interaction. We looked each other in the eye. We read subtle cues in posture and movement. We began to dance, to mimic, to follow. But we also began to judge. The upright form became a canvas for expectation. Societies drew lines around posture, what it should look like, how it should move, who could move that way. We created norms of dignity and disgrace based on the carriage of the body. We called people upright citizens, praised those who stood tall, pitied those who were bent by life. Posture became metaphor. The skeleton spoke of ethics. The spine carried honour. This burden was never part of nature's design. It was something we made, layered onto the ancient architecture of motion. In doing so, we complicated our relationship with the very thing that made us human. We no longer simply walked. We performed walking. We compared our gait to others. We analysed posture as a sign of worth, of status, of grace. And beneath it all, the original purpose still lingered, to move forward even when the path was uncertain. That has always been the underlying rhythm of our evolution. A step into the unknown, a shift in weight, a gamble. Standing upright was never a promise of safety. It was a wager placed on the possibility of seeing farther, reaching farther, becoming more. And it has carried us across continents, through ice ages, into cities, into space. But the cost of that wager is still written in our bodies. Nowhere is this cost more profoundly felt than in childbirth. The human pelvis, reshaped to support upright walking, narrowed at the same time our brains were expanding. This collision of needs, stability and intelligence led to one of evolution's most perilous compromises. Human infants must be born before they are truly ready. Their heads are large, their bodies fragile, and their survival depends not on strength but on others, on hands, on care. Bipedalism, therefore, did something quietly revolutionary. It made communal life essential. It demanded tenderness. In most mammals, birthing is solitary. In humans, it is social. The upright pelvis requires assistance. The helpless infant requires years of nurturing. And that nurturing reshaped us. It sculpted our social brain, deepened empathy, and built a species that thrived not by might, but by cooperation. The posture that isolated us from the quadrupeds bound us to each other. From this shared vulnerability came a new kind of intelligence, not just about tools or hunting, but about presence, emotional intelligence, the ability to read the face of another, to intuit need, to anticipate feeling. Standing upright placed our faces on full display. It made expressions legible, and in that visibility, emotion became conversation. A glance became a question. A sigh became a signal. A nod, an offering. Uprightness created new social choreography. We sat in circles. We stood in lines. We watched each other's movements for meaning. The body became a form of language. And in this dance of bodies and glances, something subtle emerged. Self-awareness. We began to see ourselves not just from within but from without, as others might see us. We imagined our posture through the eyes of the tribe, the stranger, the child. And this imagining birthed reflection. From reflection, identity. The modern sense of self is inseparable from how we carry ourselves. We speak of bearing, of composure, of presence. We decorate posture with clothing, shoes, rhythm. We choreograph how we enter a room, and underneath all of it the old bones still creak, still shift, still bear the weight of history. The back pain of the office worker echoes the strain of an ancient experiment. The confident stride of the performer recalls the moment an ancestor stood alone on the savannah, scanning the horizon. We are upright creatures, but we are also burdened creatures, not just by gravity, but by memory, by the long path that brought us here. And when we examine ourselves, our posture, our pain, our pride, we are really examining that path. Each vertebra is a mile marker. Each joint a fork in the evolutionary road. The way we stand today is a living archive of decisions made by bodies long gone. But reflection does something remarkable. It lets us see not just the cost of uprightness, but its meaning. Because standing tall has always signified more than survival. It is an act of declaration, a posture of intent. When our ancestors first rose onto 2 feet, they changed not just their biology, but their relationship with the world. They became watchers of the horizon, seekers of distance, their eyes lifted above the grasses, their hands freed to gesture, to craft, to comfort. This new vertical existence opened a channel between body and imagination. To stand was to envision was to aspire, and we have been aspiring ever since. Modern life complicates this ancient stance. We slump over screens, curl around exhaustion, compress the very posture that once defined our ascendance. Our technologies ease the burden of movement, but they also erode the habits that shaped us. We sit more than any ancestor ever could. We move less. We outsource our muscles to machines, and so the old pains worsen. Backs ache, necks stiffen, knees falter. It is not that evolution failed us. It is that we changed the terms of the deal without adjusting the design. Yet even now, uprightness retains its symbolic power. In the courtroom, the judge commands us to stand. In ceremonies, we rise as witnesses. In moments of pride, we straighten. In moments of sorrow, we bend. Our posture reveals the invisible weather of our inner world. It speaks before we do, and sometimes it speaks more honestly than words ever could. This connection between posture and identity is no accident. It is the residue of millions of years spent learning that how we carry ourselves influences how we are perceived and how we perceive ourselves. Upright posture widens the lungs, sharpens attention, expands awareness. It tells the nervous system, There is something ahead worth looking at, something to face, something to meet. We stand because our ancestors did. We endure what they endured. We rise where they rose. And in that rising, something quietly spiritual unfolds. Upright posture became our first metaphor, for strength, for dignity, for awakening. Religions imagined divinity in upright forms. Philosophers spoke of moral backbone. Poets adorned the spine with meaning. Standing tall became both a physical act and a philosophical one, a gesture that says, I am here. I am aware, I am part of this world. But to stand is also to remember, to feel the tug of gravity, the strain at the lower back, the subtle ache beneath the ribs. These sensations draw a line back through time to the moment we became the creatures we are. They remind us that evolution is not polished, not pristine, but raw and ongoing. Our bodies are not monuments, they are negotiations, they are stories. And as we look at ourselves now, reflected in mirrors, in screens, in the eyes of others, we see the echo of that old decision, a decision to rise, to see farther, to think deeper, to become fully human, step by step. And in the simple act of standing today, we inhabit the legacy of that first trembling ascent, the one that set the world in motion and carried us all the way to now. There is a figure standing in the grass, alone, upright and quiet, not as a conqueror of the world, but as one who has remembered something old. The wind touches their skin as it once brushed the fur of ancestors who stood in this posture for the first time, unsure of why they had risen or what horizon they hoped to see. But now, across millions of years, that simple act has folded into meaning, and the body that once balanced for survival begins to balance for understanding. What was bipedalism, really, if not a reorientation of being, of facing forward into time? To walk on 2 feet is to fall and catch oneself again and again. It is rhythm born of instability, a fragile miracle practiced billions of times a day by a species that once crawled in the safety of branches. And yet from that fragility came direction, from that repetition, cognition. Uprightness was never merely a rearrangement of limbs. It was the beginning of foresight, the elevation of the eyes above the grass, the lengthening of the breath to pace thought with motion. In time, it became more than function. It became metaphor. The child who stands for the first time echoes a lineage that has been rising not just in posture, but in perspective. But how did movement turn into meaning? How did a footstep become a sentence, a journey become a symbol? The answer perhaps is found not in the foot, but in the mind that followed it. Each step forward drew lines across the earth, paths worn into memory, trails mapped in neurons, distances not just endured, but interpreted. In this way, the horizon was not only a place to reach, but a question to ponder. What lies beyond it? Why do we seek it? Scientists now tell us that the structure of our minds is shaped, quite literally, by the act of walking. Spatial memory, our internal sense of where we are and how to return, relies on the hippocampus, a region that lights up in migratory mammals, foragers, and modern humans alike. Long before cities and scripts, there were mental maps, encoded in steps, learned by rhythm, recalled through motion. And as we walked, we imagined. As we moved, we dreamed. Could it be that philosophy began with the foot, that the contemplation of existence arose from the need to cross space with thought? Is it possible that every question we've ever asked was born in the silence between steps? A being in motion is a being awake. The land shifts underfoot, and with it, the self. And yet, even now, in the age of satellites and screens, we return to walking not just for exercise, but for clarity. We walk to think. We walk to feel. We walk to remember what the body always knew, that movement is meaning made flesh. To stand upright was to rise into consciousness, and to move forward was to begin a story that has not yet ended. What story do our steps still tell, beneath all the noise? They tell of a body that is a timeline, a living archive of decisions made under open skies. The tilt of the pelvis, the curve of the spine, the angle of the knee, each is a record of ancient compromise. We are not designed, we are adapted, and in that imperfection, there is wonder. The human form, so familiar it vanishes into daily routine, is in fact a sculpture shaped by movement, a skeleton that remembers how it learned to walk. That memory is not abstract, it is anatomical. Our feet with their arches and tendons are not just platforms, they are springs, levers and shock absorbers tuned by generations of migration. Our legs lengthen to cover more ground. Our arms, once used to swing through trees, became free to carry children, tools and eventually ideas. And our skulls tilted and rebalanced to keep our gaze steady on the path ahead, allowing us to see further, to read subtle cues in the landscape, to anticipate what might lie beyond the next bend. This balance between forward momentum and upright poise is not stable. It is an act of ongoing correction. With every step, the body performs a silent negotiation between falling and flight. We do not often notice it, but every walk we take is an echo of a deep evolutionary rhythm that once determined survival. We're always just slightly off balance, and it is in this imbalance, this constant regaining of composure, that the metaphor of walking becomes most profound. Life itself, like walking, is never static. It is always becoming. Perhaps this is why we speak of paths and journeys even when we mean thoughts and choices. To take a step back, to be at a crossroads, to follow a path. These phrases are not poetic flourishes. They are remnants of a time when thought and movement were one, when decision-making was tested by distance, when memory was measured by how far one had gone and what had been left behind. Before there were maps, there were stories. And before there were stories, there were steps. It is no coincidence that the oldest art, the oldest songs, the oldest myths, all come from cultures deeply attuned to movement. Nomadic peoples, whose lives depended on attunement to season and terrain, carried not just possessions but philosophies with them. They understood that to walk was to learn, and to remember was to move in rhythm with those who had come before. In the open air, beneath stars or sun, the ground was not just something to cross, it was something to know, and even now, we return to it. When grief becomes heavy, we walk. When decisions overwhelm us, we step outside. When we fall in love, we stroll. Movement becomes metaphor again, as it always has. In walking, we are at once modern and ancient. We are ourselves, and all who came before. The path beneath us is more than soil. It is history. It is longing. It is the continuation of a question the first upright beings asked without words. Where do we go from here? It's a question asked by every upright ancestor who paused at the edge of a clearing listening to the wind in the grass. It echoes in our minds, not as fear, but as invitation. Because walking upright was never just a biological shift. It was a philosophical one, a commitment to curiosity, an openness to the unknown. Each step forward was an act of faith, a belief that something waited ahead worth discovering. That the horizon, though distant, held meaning. This is the quiet legacy of bipedalism. It taught us not just how to move, but how to wonder. And wonder, as it turns out, was our species' greatest adaptation. Not speed, not strength, but the ability to pause, to look up, and to ask why. Bipedalism slowed us down. It made us vulnerable, yes, but in doing so, it gave us the time and the posture to observe, to connect, to reflect. With our heads lifted, our eyes could scan for signs, stars, or danger, but they could also gaze. Our ancestors did not just survive the savannas, they began to contemplate them. From those early moments of awareness emerged the first sparks of symbolic thought. Upright posture gave rise to gesture, gesture to language, and language to memory. These were not separate events. They were threads in the same tapestry, woven by the same need, to make sense of our movement across time and space. The body moved forward, but the mind stayed behind, collecting, sorting, interpreting. And so we became not just walkers, but rememberers. The body, in this light, is not just a vessel, it is a storyteller. Our gait, our balance, our breath, each is shaped by aeons of adaptation and meaning-making. The upright stance is both tool and message. It says, I am here, I have come this far, I will continue. And this message is still whispered through the quiet act of walking. Whether across a desert, through a city, or down a hallway, each step is part of that original journey. We may not always hear it, but our bodies remember. This remembrance is not just evolutionary, it is existential. In walking, we learn patience. In standing, we learn presence. In balance, we learn humility. The fragility of the upright form reminds us that strength often comes not from resistance, but from flexibility. Muscles tense and release. Joints adjust. The foot searches for ground and trusts it will be there. These are the foundations of a quiet bodily faith, not in dogma, but in experience, in movement, in process. And perhaps that is why walking has remained so symbolically powerful in every human culture. Pilgrimage, procession, pathfinding, these are rituals as old as consciousness itself. They tell us that movement can be sacred, that the act of going forward, with purpose and vulnerability, is itself a form of worship, not of gods or doctrines necessarily, but of life, of possibility, of the human capacity to rise, to stumble, to continue. So where do we go from here? Perhaps nowhere new. Perhaps we simply continue along the same ancient path, one step at a time, with eyes lifted and questions intact. Because even now, in a world of asphalt and algorithms, the body still walks. It remembers how. The hips shift, the arms swing, the spine balances the cranium with quiet grace. These motions, repeated 1,000,000 times across a lifetime, are not merely habitual, they are echoes. Every step we take today carries the memory of those first uncertain movements through Miocene grasslands. Our physiology is not separate from our story. It is our story. The arch of the foot, the angle of the pelvis, the curve of the lower back, each is a sentence in the long narrative of standing, stumbling, and continuing forward. And as we walk, we reflect. There is a reason so many of our insights arrive mid-stride. The body's rhythm invites the mind into rhythm, and thought begins to move like breath. In the gentle cadence of footsteps, we often find clarity that stillness denies us. The trail becomes a corridor of cognition. Ideas arrive not as commands, but as companions, walked with, not forced. And through this physical dialogue between landscape and body, the mind loosens its grip on certainty. It becomes receptive, open, wondering. This is not a coincidence. Studies in neuroscience now suggest what our ancestors perhaps intuited, that movement stimulates cognition, that the prefrontal cortex, the seat of planning, attention and self-awareness, is nourished by the act of walking. As blood flows and joints align, neurons fire in new configurations. Creativity blossoms not in confinement, but in motion. The path does not just carry us across terrain, it changes how we think. In this light, the long journey out of Africa, across plains, over mountains, through ice and drought, can be read not only as a migration of bodies, but of minds, a psychological unfolding. Each biome crossed, each season endured, was not just a trial of endurance, it was a lesson. And from these lessons, culture emerged. Not quickly, not easily, but rhythmically, one step at a time. Eventually, these steps became rituals, and rituals became stories. The track in the mud became a symbol, the journey a myth. We see this reflected even today in the stories we tell about quests, about departures and returns, about trials and revelations. The hero's journey, in all its narrative forms, is also a walking story, a metaphor for the evolutionary arc we've traced with our own 2 feet. And through all of it, upright posture has remained our silent companion. At times a burden, at times a blessing, but always a marker. It distinguishes us not only from our ancestors, but from our former selves. To walk upright is to carry history in your bones, to bear the weight of memory, vulnerability, and awareness in every step. We don't often think of it that way. But perhaps we should, because even in our most modern moments, in airports, in hallways, on treadmills, we are still, in essence, participating in a ritual older than language. The path beneath us may be paved, but the journey remains the same, and so we arrive, not at a conclusion, but at a return, to the open sky, to the rustle of grass, to the upright figure standing not above nature, but within it, at once fragile and majestic, exposed and yet elevated. To walk upright is to say, I am here, I move forward, I remember. It is an act both ordinary and profound. And when we trace that act backward through deep time, through bones in volcanic ash, through footprints fossilized by chance, through migrations whispered in the genome, we realize something quietly astonishing. That survival was never just the point. Not entirely. Something else was stirring beneath the adaptation, a longing, a pull, a question. Why do we stand? Why do we leave shelter? Why do we go on walking, even when it hurts, even when it costs, even when the destination is uncertain? Perhaps it is because walking upright freed more than our hands. It freed our sight. It turned our gaze from the soil to the skyline. It allowed us not only to reach, but to witness. Not only to escape, but to dream. And with each step forward, something ancient returns. A rhythm that grounds us. A posture that reminds us we belong to a lineage not of domination, but of wonder. We are not the only creatures to walk, but we are the only ones to wonder why. It's in this wondering that consciousness blossoms, not as dominance, but as recognition. The upright body carries not only tools or burdens or infants. It carries perspective, it carries awe. And perhaps that was the hidden gift of bipedalism all along. Not just hands to shape the world, but eyes to witness it, a mind to remember it, a soul, maybe, to feel it. So if you find yourself walking beneath stars tonight, or along a quiet road at dusk, or even pacing the halls of a sleepless moment, know that you are not alone. Your stride carries echoes, your posture holds time, you're the latest chapter in a story written not in ink but in movement. And every step forward is also a return to balance, to memory, to the flicker in the grass. Thank you, fellow sapiens, for walking this long road through the upright shadow of time, through fire and ash, across savannas and ice, past stone tools and shared silence, to arrive here, where the sky still meets the grass. If this story helped you feel a flicker of wonder, a moment of stillness, or the deep rhythm of something older than memory, thank you for letting it travel with you. Your presence in this long unfolding means more than you know. I wonder what part of this story will remain with you. Perhaps a shape in the distance, a footstep in the dust, or a single question rising like smoke from the coals. Whether it was the image of hands freed by balance, the quiet echo of firelit storytelling, or the enduring sense of walking toward the unknown, these fragments are what connect us, stitch us together across time, and remind us we are never walking alone. If any moment in this journey stayed with you, feel free to share it in the comments, not as noise but as a quiet offering, one more voice in the circle of our kind. If you'd like to follow where this path leads next, liking or subscribing helps keep the fire burning, and there are many more stories still waiting to be unearthed. Until we meet again, stay curious, stay thoughtful,